Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John Dehlin. It's May 7th, 2023, and today I'm super excited for our interview. Today we're interviewing Saane Siale. Hey, Saane, how's it going?
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and we also have in studio a face that will be familiar to many of you. Nate's joining us. Hey, Nate, how's it going?
Going good, John. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah. And Saane and Nate, Saane, why is Nate here?
Well, for one, he's a really good friend of mine. We go way back, not only through attending BYU, but also being a part of Black Student Union, which is a club at BYU, and also just being involved with activism in general when we were on that campus.
Yeah. Yeah, so you were super close to Nate and many of his friends.
Yes.
And Nate, I just love having you here. I asked that hypothetically, but the truth is I'm super glad you're here. Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here for sure, and happy to be able to support Saane. We've been in a lot of the same circles for years, so.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Nate.
So I guess one of the main themes is going to be like being a racial minority, cultural minority at BYU.
For sure.
What that's like.
Yeah.
Trying to fight for equality or social justice at BYU. And and then I guess you have, we've probably had a few people on Mormon Stories that come from kind of some of the Polynesian countries, but your ancestry comes from Tonga.
Yes,
right?
that's correct. Yeah, I'm full Tongan.
So this will be a Tongan Mormon story as well.
Yeah.
I don't know that we've ever really had that before, so I'm super excited about that. So who's this curly-haired dude that's with us?
This is my old bishop.
Bishop Beau.
Yeah,
Yes,
Bishop Beau.
Bishop Beau.
Bishop O? Is it Bishop O or Bishop Beau?
Bishop Beau. Yeah. So I'm Beau Oyler, and huge fan of Saane, and just one more way in which I get to show my love and support for her.
Yes.
So happy to be here.
Yeah, and for those of you who have followed Mormon Stories for years, I guess Saane grew up in Carolyn Pearson's ward. That'll be a name that'll be familiar with many of you.
That is true.
And Beau served as bishop of that ward.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Both Saane's bishop and Carolyn Pearson's bishop.
Yep.
For 5-ish years.
5 years.
In Walnut Creek or Oakland?
Yeah,
or?
Walnut Creek. It's just east of Oakland. So we were in the Oakland stake.
Yeah.
And I got to, serve with Carolyn Pearson and Saane and so many amazing people.
Oh, yes. I loved that word.
So shout out to Carolyn. I'm sure she'll be joining in. So you've got your posse here with you.
Yes.
All right.
100%.
All right. And oftentimes we like to begin Mormon Stories by giving people a chance to kind of state their intention, why they want to do Mormon Stories. Sometimes people make assumptions about what it means to go on either Mormon Stories or just to speak publicly in a cultural context where it's discouraged sometimes to speak openly and candidly, especially if your speech involves criticisms. So what would you like to state to begin with about your intentions of why you wanted to tell your story?
Yeah. Even today being May 7th, the month of May is AAPI month, which stands for Asian American and Pacific Islander month. And the reason why I bring that up is being someone that is Pacific Islander, specifically Polynesian, I'm really passionate about highlighting voices from my own community, from my ethnic racial background. And so that's a little bit about my intention, is really being another voice that people may not have had access to hear otherwise. And so that's really what it's about for me, being able to share, again, not trying to speak for the entire Pacific Islander community, but really just adding a voice, my own voice and my own story. And what that and how that could relate to other people and resonate with other people is also a hope that I have by being here.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
All right. And gentlemen, you guys chime in whenever you want. Is that all right?
Sounds good.
Again, it's great to have you both. All right. Saane, so where does your Mormon story begin? I'm sure it begins before you were born. Is that right?
Yes, 100%. When I think about where it begins, it really starts with my dad. My dad, to give you guys context, he will turn 80 on June 26th.
And you're how old?
I am 26.
Okay.
Yes. So I grew up having a father that was obviously a lot older than my peers' fathers. And so that was a very obvious thing growing up. My dad could be my grandpa, also my great-grandpa to some people. So anyways, my dad grew up hardcore Methodist. So he grew up in the Methodist church. His dad was a priest.
In Tonga.
In Tonga, yes. Yeah. My dad grew up in the island of Vava'u, but he was actually taken to the capital, Nuku'alofa, at a young age. And through that, he had a great introduction to education. Education is something that my dad really, really, really cared about. It's right next to his belief in God. So God and education. So, and so that was always something that naturally came to him, and having this kind of sense of learning and growing his own knowledge of the world. He's just a natural student is how I would describe my dad. And growing up, I mean, my dad graduated at the top of his class. He's received the highest honors that you possibly could get in education. It was through education that actually drew him to a position within royalty. What I mean by that is my dad grew up in poverty. So the island that he came from, a lot of people refer to, quote unquote, as the bush. And so when my dad came to the capital, I mean, my dad was considered a commoner, but it was through education that my dad kind of excelled and had access to opportunities. It's funny because he mentioned how there was a newspaper advertisement for a position to work within the parliament, so to be the secretary to the king. And so my dad saw that. He applied for it. He was asked to be interviewed. And once he was interviewed, he was immediately offered the position. And
So he's working for the King of Tonga.
Yes, King Tebow IV at the time.
Yeah.
So yeah. And so he worked within the parliament. And so the way that he described his position, he was the secretary to the king. So if you wanted to meet with the king, you had to see my dad first. So my dad was the face, basically, of the palace. And so whether that was with government officials, even leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, my dad met with first. To, well, for one, create relationships and also handle meetings. My dad would basically, he planned everything that the king would do, the people that he would see, my dad was a part of organizing. And so, my dad met a lot of church leaders. For instance, he met David O. McKay. He met Gordon B. Hinckley when he was an apostle, and Thomas S. Monson also when he was an apostle. Obviously at the time he didn't know what their position was or what that meant. To him, it's just white men, Americans.
Let me ask, one thing that people may not know about the Mormon Church, and maybe many church members won't know, is that islands or countries like Tonga and Samoa have a very high percentage of LDS church members.
Oh, yes, they do.
Do you know anything about the history of how the Mormon Church got such a high percentage of membership in those two countries specifically?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it really goes back to the relationships that the church, like I was explaining with my dad, the relationships that the church made with not only, well, at least in Tonga, I can speak for Tonga. I don't really know much about Samoa. But what I would think of first is really the relationships that the church established with the royal families within the different islands. Like I said, my dad, obviously organized meetings with the highest church authorities with the king. And so if you can get the king on board, obviously it's much easier to get an entire people who already follow the royal family to also join in on what is this church, what is this message that they have to offer. Even in the island of Tonga, they have what's called the Liahona High School, which my dad also helped establish, which obviously if you know, obviously where Liahona comes from, that's obviously from the LDS Church, is a school that they built and funded. And so I think that also helped as well, the church kind of establishing different organizations that kind of helped uplift like people within the islands. That was I think a huge draw in for people, and obviously missionary work, just sending tons of missionaries. One of the ways that, obviously my dad met with different church authorities. They had obviously expressed to my dad their testimonies, taught my dad a lot. But it was really through missionaries that my dad chose to be baptized. And so,
Did any members of the Tongan royal family ever convert to the church?
Oh yeah, there's plenty. I can't specifically name each and every one, but yeah, there are definitely people from the royal family throughout the history of Tonga that have converted to the LDS Church.
So the Mormon Church would have sent missionaries to Tonga, and then at some point baptized some or many of the royal family, and then the island. Do you have a sense for what percentage of the people on the island are LDS?
Yeah, so the last statistic that I saw, at least from the islands of Tonga, 64% are considered LDS.
Yeah, that's
and then
crazy.
The other, that's a huge.
Utah's not even 64% active Mormon.
Right. Yeah.
So it's, but it's not an official religion of the island, but over half.
Over half, yes.
Okay, that's significant.
Huge number. There's about 19 stakes in the islands of Tonga, and in Samoa, there's 26 stakes. And then even in the islands of Tahiti, which is actually where I served my mission, 1 in 10 are LDS, part of the church. So huge numbers within Polynesia.
And from my time working at church headquarters, the activity rates in both Tonga and Samoa are actually very high.
I believe it, yeah.
In terms of not just membership, but people attending regularly.
Right.
So is it a very Mormon island? Is that even fair to say?
I would say that, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I think of my dad, he's very hardcore Mormon, I would describe him. And my dad was actually, so he's the oldest in his family, and he was the first to join the church, which was huge because he came from a very strictly Methodist family. His dad was a minister for the Methodist Church. And so that was not common for somebody like my dad and the background that he came from to convert.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so your dad gets a job with the king.
Yes.
But at that point wasn't LDS.
Nope.
Okay, and then at some point he converted.
Yes. So he started working for the king in 1968. So my dad was born in 1943, so he was roughly in his early 20s. He was about my age, actually, in 1969 when he was officially baptized. He always reminds me of the date, March 25th, 1969, he was baptized. He counts that as his second birthday. So...
And that's the year I was born, just to give everyone context.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yes. And so, my dad was baptized. And it was actually through my dad's position that he was able to come to America in 1972.
Okay.
Yeah. And so the church leaders actually told my dad how to start the immigration process.
Do you know why he wanted to come here? Like, he had a pretty sweet gig with the king.
Yeah. Main thing was honestly access to education. My dad's big thing was, and also the idea of the American dream. That was something that was very real, whether it was through watching English American movies growing up. My dad just always had this idea that, America is where it's at. That's where I want to establish my own name and my future family. And so, that was a huge motivating factor. And the thing is, like I said, if you remember how my dad grew up, he would have never had that opportunity. But he was in probably one of the highest positions he could ever get, coming from the background that he did. And so for my dad, it was really like, it was his one chance to go to America. Because at the time, the position that my dad held, they did not have contracts. So how long my dad would have stayed in the position or they would have kept him, it was never guaranteed. And so my dad didn't know for sure if he would have had that position for another 5 years or maybe just another year and a half. And so for my dad at that time, his thinking was just like, it's now or never. And this is the best chance that I have to use the position that I am in to come to America.
This is probably an impossible question to answer, but I'm wondering, like, the average LDS church member in Tonga, what are the 5 most common jobs they would have in Tonga? You know what I mean?
Ooh, that's
like, it's a different
good question.
It's a different economic system, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's so different. And
I'm
there's so
probably
much
putting you on the
history
spot.
to
You
it.
didn't grow up there, so
No, yeah. I mean, in terms of positions, obviously there's the farming, because like you have the different plantations, also positions within like teaching at schools. Before my dad taught at government schools. He also was able to teach. So he was a teacher. So that was a position that my dad had held.
Do you know the most common crops that are grown in Tonga? Do you even know?
It's so different. I'm not exactly sure. And I mean, there's a lot of like background history that a lot of people don't know about in terms of like colonization and the exploitation of like Polynesian islands really affected like natural resources. And then which made islanders reliant on shipped goods. And so that's something that people don't understand. I mean, and there's a huge Chinese presence actually within the islands of Tonga, which is a huge issue because you have people, foreigners that are coming to the islands. And we see this with Hawaii too. We see people that are foreigners to this land that are kind of taking jobs away from natives. And so that's also a huge issue that my dad's very passionate about.
I'll just throw this open.
So yeah,
I want to interview some people who grew up in Tonga, who grew up in Samoa.
Yes.
And get that perspective as well.
100%.
And I'll just say that it's been really challenging to get people to come on Mormon Stories, not because they don't love Mormon stories or want to tell their story, but there's this sense of cultural duty where they feel like they'll be betraying their culture, their family, if they tell their story. But there's got to be a few of you out there who grew up in Tonga or Samoa who want to tell your story. So instead
I support that.
asking Saane to represent you all, we're going to have you represent yourself. How's that?
Exactly.
And I'll stop asking you questions about Tonga.
I love it. Thank you.
All right. So your dad, so the king helps your dad come to the United States. Is that right?
Yes. So
Okay.
my dad entered the immigration process, so applied for like a work visa. My dad had visited the States before with the king, just for obviously meetings with other government leaders from the U.S. Like my dad had flown to New York City with the king. But again, that was just for visiting purposes. But yeah, at that time in 1972, my dad actually made the quest to actually apply and to come to America. And so again, my dad was the first member and also the first person to come to America as well. So yeah.
And he came to LA first, right?
Yes, LA area. That is correct.
So what else do you want to say about your dad and or your mom before we get into your story?
Yeah, sure. I'll talk a little bit about my mom. I think that's a good intro in terms of my dad and his background and kind of the path that he set for obviously me. My mom was baptized before she met my dad, so she was already a member, and so she was married to her first husband, got divorced. She had 3 boys with her first husband, and she was living in Arizona at the time.
And she's of Tongan origin.
Yes, that's correct. From the
but
capital.
Grew up where?
She grew up in the capital, so Nuku'alofa.
Oh,
so my
okay.
dad is not from there, but my mom is, and so yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, my mom grew up there, and so she obviously had traveled to New Zealand, Australia, did school here and there, had experience in journalism here and there, but yeah, had her roots in Arizona with her first family, and then after the divorce, soon after met my dad, and so yeah, she was pregnant with me and got married with my dad, and yeah, here I am.
Okay. So you were born in what year?
So I was born in 1996.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
It's a good year.
Yep, a good year.
Is that when you were born, Nate?
That's when I was born too.
96? Mm-hmm. Do you feel old, Beau?
And I was a senior in high school in 96.
I was 3 years out of BYU.
Wow, that's crazy.
It's crazy how old I am. Is that what you're saying?
No, it's
We're ancient, John.
Are we in the same category?
I think we are. In this room right now, I think we're in the same category.
Okay, so your parents met and got married where?
in Arizona, and so they moved
Okay.
to California.
Now,
And so-
really quickly, okay, So there are, for those who don't know, there are decent-sized Polynesian, LDS-based Polynesian communities in various cities and states in the United States. So is
Yes.
that right?
Yes, 100%.
And so is that true in Arizona? And I know that's true in
Yes.
Oakland
Yes.
and elsewhere, right?
That is very true. Yeah. So I would say Mesa, Phoenix, Arizona area. Obviously here in Utah, Salt Lake, West Valley. I mean, really all over Provo, Utah County. And then, yeah, California as well, SoCal, so LA, and then back in the Bay Area, Oakland, San Francisco. I mean, we have our own Tongan steak back home, which my dad is now a part of. And so, yeah, huge presence.
And this may be totally not a fit, but you think about like cities will have a Chinatown or whatever, right? Like, or in a Little Italy.
Right.
Are there like little Samoan or Tongan enclaves where they tend to geographically actually be located in a concentrated way?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah,
Tonga?
that's a great question. Sure, I would say yes.
So in the Bay Area, for example.
Like in the Bay Area, I mean, it's interesting because the LDS Church is so much a part of the culture. It's almost a part of the culture. Like it's not even like a religion at that point. It's literally like combined with the lifestyles of being Tongan and being LDS and Mormon. Like that's like one and the same. And so, for example, the Oakland Temple, that I would consider like a point of gathering for LDS Tongan or LDS Polynesian members that congregate in that area. So I don't know if that makes sense, but
it's like a cultural center.
Yes, for sure.
The Oakland Temple,
for sure, 100%.
would be a cultural center for Tongans in the Bay Area.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah,
So they would live around the Oakland.
Not necessarily live around. Yeah, live close enough to obviously drive within 10, 15 minutes, at the most 30 minutes. But yeah, huge place of gathering. Even with like dances, that's a huge thing that my parents recently went to a Mother's Day dance, and huge flock of all these Tongan OGs that are all LDS. And so, yeah, I would definitely say for sure that that's a place of gathering.
It's already coming to my mind that there has to be this beautiful Tongan/Mormon culture in all its different varieties throughout the United States.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing that when Tongans joined the church, they had to leave some of their culture behind to join the church. And I wonder if if there's a rub there. There's a beauty of the Mormon/Tongan culture, and maybe some things that got lost along the way.
Oh, for sure, 100%. I think it would be unfair to not say that things weren't lost. I think there are things that were. And so, I mean, that's something that I've seen in my own experience. And again, there is beauty in the way that, I mean, I recently attended a funeral for my brother-in-law's mom, and so and it was held within an LDS church, and so there's beauty in how easy it is for people to gather and come together. I think that's something that's really important to see and recognize. That's something that I valued growing up, was seeing how easy it was for people to come together community-wise within both the church and culturally. But yeah, are there things that have been lost along the way? I definitely think so. Especially when you look at like the conservatism within like the LDS church and like and how that's affected even a lot of Tongan members that I know. My dad is hardcore conservative, hardcore Republican. Wasn't always. He was Democrat. He actually voted for Obama and then voted for Trump. So very different, obviously, points of views. But that's something that I've had to reckon with myself, and seeing how almost the church comes before, obviously, like what I know to be like deeply cultural beliefs. It's interesting. But again, in Tonga, I mean, if you see the Tongan flag, the red part of it represents the blood of Christ. We literally have the cross within like our flag. So, I mean, Christ in and of itself is a huge part of the fabric of Tongan society and Tongan culture. So Christianity is just already woven into what it means to be Tongan. Now, what that looks like with obviously the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is obviously different, I would say.
Beau, I'm curious, just as an observer and as an outsider, you lived in the Bay Area how long?
Pretty much my whole life. Yeah, so 40 years.
Yeah.
So
I'm sure as a LDS church member, spending a lot of time in the Bay Area, you probably had perceptions or experiences with the Polynesian LDS communities in the Bay Area. Is there any observations you want to make about that?
I think what Saane was saying about these places of gathering, Tongans know how to party. Okay, like straight up know how to party.
That's what you experienced.
Yeah. I think two things. One is you always knew that there was a Tongan party, and that they bring you in, they invite you, and like they're really fun, lots of food, And then the other thing was gathering on Sundays up at the temple. So it's really common if you live in the Bay Area to go to the temple on a Sunday afternoon, go to the visitor center. Maybe you have church at the stake center next to the temple. And I mean, at least 50% of the folks that are up at on temple, the temple grounds, Temple Hill, are Polynesian. And there's always gathering there and bringing food and big families and touring the visitor center. And it's just kind of part, I guess you don't really think about it after a time, but it's just always, a part of kind of that, LDS community in Oakland.
Yeah.
And you said there's a steak. What type?
It's a full Polynesian steak that covers the whole Bay Area.
Yeah.
Now, is that complicated to just lump all Polynesians together? Because there's going to be differences between Hawaiians and Tongans and Samoans, et cetera.
Yeah.
Well, I guess let me start. Why would there be a Polynesian steak?
That's a good question.
Mostly for better singing, I think, at church.
Maybe. We can sing. We can sing.
No, but there wouldn't have been like a Western European steak, or
right,
or like Eastern United States steak. So can you guys help me? Why would there have ever been a ward or a steak around a specific origin?
No, I mean, that's a great question. That's a really great question, especially when we talk about, well, how about other racial ethnic communities? Like, why don't we see a black steak? Or, I mean, obviously you hear things like there's Spanish wards. Obviously they don't come from the same country, but they come from Spanish-speaking countries. In
my mind, that happens because of the language barrier, right?
For sure. That's a huge part, especially if you were to attend a ward where it's majority Tongans or majority Samoans. Almost all 100% you can guarantee that the service will be held in the native tongue. And so I growing up in the church, I was born in the church. I grew up in a Tongan ward. And so, the service, sacrament, everything was done in Tongan.
A Tongan ward.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So within the steak, there would be Tongan wards and Samoan wards?
No, I think that within Tonga, the way that it's set up is that the Polynesian steak has Tongan wards, Samoan wards, but all within that steak. Once you get outside of that steak, like the Oakland steak, for example, isn't a Polynesian-specific steak. And so you wouldn't have a Tongan ward in the Oakland steak. You would have a Tongan ward in the Polynesian steak.
Yes, that's correct.
So it was a language. It was driven by language then?
I would that would be a central reason as to why I think having a Polynesian steak would definitely be a language barrier for sure.
So did you grow up speaking Tongan?
A little here and there. So I mean, I lost it very quickly because I had to learn English. But I had, luckily for my first early years, my dad's mother, my grandma Va, she helped obviously speaking Tongan. But eventually being in obviously school and going to school and being around majority English speakers, spoke English for most of my life growing up. But I can understand pretty well.
Okay, so you were in a Tongan ward for how long?
I mean, up until age 6, and then I moved into what we call a palangi ward, which translation-wise means white ward.
Palangi?
Palangi, yes.
Palangi.
Yes.
Is that kind of the equivalent of haole?
Yes. It's the equivalent.
It's what you call white people, basically.
Pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
It's a gringo word.
Yeah. So I grew up for the rest of my experience growing up Mormon and being LDS was in a white ward. So yeah.
Is there a story behind why your family moved to a white ward?
Oh yeah. It's interesting. My parents' reasoning was just more so, their ideology was just like the white ward was better than the Tongan ward that we were in. The Tongan ward that we were in, I mean, I don't remember much. I was obviously only 6, but it was very disorganized. It was kind of like lax here and there with how, the various rituals, sacrament, even Sunday school was very disorganized. And so my parents' reasoning of taking me and my brother at the time, we're a year apart, he was born in 1997, was really just more to give us more structure. It's the same reason why, I mean, obviously lived in different areas of the Bay Area, but my parents were very intentional in putting me in schools in affluent areas with majority white population because those were the schools that had better resources. And so kind of the same reason my parents, specifically moved me into that ward that I grew up in.
I mean, there's already for me in my mind some tension there. I mean, let me actually ask this in a different way. So the Book of Mormon teaches this whole narrative about dark skin being a curse, and that Lamanites were cursed with dark skin for their wickedness, and that the Native Americans that you would see around us today, which according to Mormonism includes Polynesians, would be descendants of those who were cursed, and so there's that whole association. So can you share growing up to what sense you made of the dark skin curse in the Book of Mormon and how it related to you and your family? Because when I hear about a Tongan family wanting to move to a white ward, then what immediately comes to my mind is there's some self-loathing, is there some self-hatred of their skin color or their origins, and this whole idea of white and delights them moving towards whiteness as sort of like bettering yourself. I know there's probably all sorts of wrong things with what I just said, but it's how questions that are coming up in my mind.
For sure. And I think that's a really important question. I think growing up, that wasn't really a specific conversation that I had with my parents. That wasn't really something that I heard specifically in the context of like the Lamanites or the dark skin curse or anything of that sort. That was never something that I talked about with my parents or heard them talk about. It was
Y'all didn't identify as Lamanites?
No, that was never something that we identified as or talked about. I mean, if I were to have a conversation with my dad now, probably maybe he might have his own understanding, but that was never at the forefront of like any conversation that I had growing up within the church. But I think just overall within the Pacific Islander community and with at least Tongans from my experience, there's definitely already this idea of like anti-blackness and so anti-dark skin. Like that is just in terms of like standards of beauty, inferior. That's an actual like ideal dark skin, so darker skin. And so that's something that I at least grew up understanding. Like for instance, like my family members telling me not to stay out in the dark. I mean, it's just not in the dark, the sun for too long, or it might get darker and that's ugly. That's considered, less than. Those were ideas that I was obviously taught. Thankfully, didn't keep those ideas, obviously challenged those very early on, but that was something that was very real within the Tongan community, and even something that I heard my dad say growing up. But yeah, it was never really tied with like the curse of the dark skin. That was never something that my parents talked about. I mean, it wasn't until my mission that I actually learned about that. But yeah, at least growing up within the white ward that I attended, that wasn't specific as a reason to why, but it was obviously something that I recognized just in my surroundings. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. So was it more implicit than explicit? Maybe?
For sure. Definitely implicit. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'd add to that, like your dad would give his testimony every month.
Yes,
right?
every month.
And he's a powerful man. He really is. And you never knew the ride that you were in for when Brother Siale got up to give his testimony. But
anxiety.
Every time that, I could always see like the anxiety come over. But every time they did, he always bore testimony of why he is raising his family in Walnut Creek.
That's true.
Right? To go to better schools. And then he would say, to be around members like you. And so it wasn't so much a self-loathing that I felt, but it was more of a, hey, you're up here on this plane, and so I want to raise my family around you,
yes, 100%.
Upper middle class, white people, so that they can be like you.
Yep.
Right? So it was more of an aspirational thing, it seemed like, than it was a self-loathing. Even if self-loathing was inside somewhere, it was more of a, hey, like I'm making sacrifices as a parent to raise my kids here amongst you.
Exactly. Because obviously, I mean, my dad would have preferred to be around people that speak Tongan. Mm-hmm. That was always his preference, which is why he's back in the Tongan stake now. Because all of my siblings were all adults, and so we're out of the house. And so he doesn't have to worry about taking us to church. So yeah, I would totally agree with what Beau said. It was really just, and I don't think my dad really realized, obviously, the complications of like systemic racism, and obviously why, zip codes right next to each other, you have more affluent white populations, and then on the other side of town, very, diverse, ethnically, racially diverse populations. But yeah, my dad just noticed that there were better access to opportunities within a white ward and within the area that I went to school in. Mm-hmm. And so that was my dad's observation, and so that's why he made that choice for me and my siblings.
Mm. So there's a strong desire to improve kind of the socioeconomic and educational status of your kids.
For sure.
Which means more and more integration with the white community.
Yeah.
And then, of course, that's going to mean leaving some of your Tonganness behind in various ways, I guess. Or maybe you could do both. Maybe you could have it both. You can stay super Tongan and be raised in a white ward. I don't know. I guess we'll find out.
But remember, your dad did join the church during like the Kimball era, right? So it's not that this is coming from nowhere. I mean, this kind of white nationalism and this like very patriotic, very conservative. Yeah. Like that's when he joined the church. That's what he's coming into.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, his first introduction to the church is unique in comparison to others. He met white American leaders of like the top authorities of the church. Those were the people that my dad met. So when we talk about the American dream, he talked about that with them. He saw that in them. And so, yeah.
Okay. So do you have many Mormon memories of that Tongan ward, or most of your Mormon memories, once you moved? Was it Walnut Creek? Was that?
Yeah.
Was it? Okay.
Yep. Walnut Creek Second Ward. Yeah. Most of my Mormon memories definitely come from growing up within, the White Ward, Walnut Creek Ward. Yeah.
So what was that like for you?
Ooh.
What percentage of the ward would have been Polynesian?
Oh, we were the only family. Yeah. Yeah.
And is it a vibrant ward, a full ward?
I would say so. I mean, I feel like our ward, at least, and you can chime in, Beau, was a very transient ward. People came. I mean, I just remember a lot of people that, had just graduated BYU would come. Like our ward was the ward that they moved into. Mm-hmm. And
young couples.
Yeah, young couples.
Moving out to the Bay Area.
Yeah.
To
families.
Get a start in tech or in
kind of
finance
it's like they've graduated from their undergrad. They have a job in tech or finance or law or whatever, and it's pre-MBA. So it's kind of this 2-year window in which people would come in, rent a place downtown Walnut Creek, and be in the Walnut Creek Second Ward. Very transient, very dynamic is what I called it. So people were in and out. 80% of the ward were renters, right? So only about 20% or less owned a home in Walnut Creek Second Ward. Yeah. And so just a lot of movement, a lot of different people, a lot of different, but a very unique phase of life, kind of younger.
So I guess makes sense that the lowest priced housing was in this ward. Is that right? Which would
just the most rentals, just a lot of rentals. So a lot of condos, a lot of apartments.
And so those who did own homes, how would you characterize, those homes? I don't know how to ask that.
Yeah, homes, like nice homes. There's some people owned condos, but most of the owners, people that owned homes were like, single family homes and pretty affluent.
So 10 to 20% of the ward was affluent.
Yes.
And then there was a bunch of just young...
Either affluent or had been there for a long time. And so bought a home 20, 30 years ago and were still there. Yeah, but not a ton of affluency. In Walnut Creek, it wasn't like we weren't the affluent ward in the stake.
Oh, yeah, we definitely weren't.
No.
Yeah.
No, because you've got the Berkeley ward, the Oakland wards. You've got Moraga, Lafayette. Like these are really, really nice areas. And so you have this spectrum that's really cool. Walnut Creek on the east side, which is more in the middle. And then you've got all the way to West Oakland, right? Which is, West Oakland. And so you have this huge spectrum of life in the Oakland stake, which kind of makes it magical.
So the Oakland stake covers, or at least it covered most of Oakland?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Most of Oakland and Berkeley.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. That's a lot.
It's a lot.
For a single stake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean,
for such a big city, one stake in such a big city.
Yeah. Yeah. We used to get 1,500 people out to our state conferences. We'd hold them in the big auditorium up at the temple. And
oh, yeah. Remember those?
Yeah. And they were just like musical celebrations back in the day. It was pretty cool.
And one more thing, I remember a discussion of someone named Dean Criddle, I think was his name, when Marlon Jensen goes out to Oakland during the LGBT Prop 8 kind of aftermath, and he gives sort of a semi-apology. He gives a personal apology, but it's a stake where there's a lot of LGBT people.
Yes.
And he gives that apology. But I just remember Carolyn talking about him being the super progressive, yet faithful Mormon stake president.
Yeah.
That's
President Criddle. Yeah, that's Dean Criddle. He's the one who called me to be bishop in 2012. Just an amazing man. And very much not just progressive, looking to move forward, like proactively progressing and moving forward and helping his stake members move forward. And so we got babysat a lot. We get general authorities almost every single stake conference to come and, slap hands and put us back into shape. And President Criddle didn't care. He just did what was right for his people. He's an amazing man.
I mean, I think for those who like to geek out on Mormonism, I imagine he served for 10 years. Like those 10 years where Dean Criddle is presiding as a stake president over this stake, there's probably some really special and important things that happened that are going to get lost to history if people don't talk about it.
And some really painful things too. I mean, that was during Prop 8, he was stake president. It was during the exclusion policy in 2015, he was stake president. So there were some painful years there as well. And he really found this balance of helping people and vocally telling, like, do what you feel right about. And that was really special as a to have a stake president saying, here's what the church is asking us to do. Okay, Prop 8, for example, but do what you feel right about. He was very clear about that.
That's a special context. And you were there during that whole time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was there during 2008, it was 2008. Yeah, Prop 8. I was on my mission in Prop 22, so I missed that. And then I was there for Prop 8.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's just some context. And I wonder if you were oblivious to all of this going on at the time it was going on.
Not with Prop 8. That's actually something that I have a core memory. It's interesting because I look back and...
You would have been how old?
Oh, I remember being in middle school. I was in middle school for sure. So 6th, 7th grade. So 12-ish. But I remember, I didn't even remember exactly what it was about. I just remember being in church and people telling us to protect the church. And so for me, having grown up, and if you know my dad, like Beau said, he's a very powerful man, very spiritual, religious man. I was proud of that. And being the oldest, my dad kind of placed that kind of like passing the baton, like you stand up for the church, you bear testimony. And so when it came to the conversation surrounding Prop 8, for me, it was about protecting the church, but I had no idea the context within the LGBTQ plus community in the context of same-sex marriage. I remember having like a Prop 8 sticker in middle school and one of my friends telling me, do you know what that means? And she was shocked that I had that sticker. And I remember being caught off guard because in my mind, I was protecting my religion. I was protecting something that was important to my family and to my dad. And I remember seeing protesters, and we would, like show off our Prop 8 posters. And again, not even understanding exactly what this meant and what that meant for queer families and queer people in general. And so, I look back at that, and I'm sad that, I wasn't really given the opportunity to really choose for myself had I known the full context and full meaning of what that proposition would have meant for real families.
Sure.
And I'd add to that too, like, so I was an adult during that time and had a young family and was asked to do, to be an activist for this.
Yes. Yeah.
And so that it lit that spirit of activism. But I think for me and for many of us during that time, it was also one of the most powerful experiences of cognitive dissonance,
Yes.
of kind of this, emotional dissonance where it's like the prophet, the church is asking us to do this thing, and I want to be obedient. I want to sustain the prophet. But inside of me, in my heart, when I think of my friends and my family members who are in the queer community, I'm like, how can I do this? Like, this doesn't feel right.
Exactly.
Neither of these feel right.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, it was one of those first times where it's like, okay, I don't know how to hold both of these things.
Oh, yeah. The same thing for me. And even in 7th grade at that time, that was my first experience with my close friend. He came out to me. I was the first person. Of all people, he chose the Mormon to come out to. And
He was not LDS.
He was not LDS.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He came from a Christian background as well. But I was the first person that he came out to. And again, the same thing where I was just like, wait, but this is my friend.
Yeah.
This is somebody that I feel love for and compassion for. And what I'm doing, these posters, stickers that I'm holding is hurting him and is scaring him. And he's only in 7th grade. And I am too. And so, definitely first experience of like, it sparked activism in me, but also like, what does this actually mean? And so, I mean, Nate, did you even know like what Proposition 8? Obviously, you didn't grow up in California, but
Yeah, to be honest, I had heard of it. Like I remember, I feel like getting a letter that they read, and they read a letter to everybody in the church, and the bishop got up and read it. But I didn't really know what it was about, and I think probably the difference for me was that I didn't grow up like being surrounded by lots of different kinds of people.
Gotcha.
Like my upbringing was very isolated, and so for you, like having that friend that was someone who was queer and then coming out to you, that gave you a different perspective. Whereas for me, like my whole world was pretty much LDS, except for like the few people that I went to school with that I wasn't really close with. And it wasn't until I got to BYU when I like actually got around other people and realized, hey, there are people from like all different walks of life. Like started realizing like how my decisions affect other people. That's like when my mindset really started to change.
Yes. Yeah. I was curious.
Hey, John, you had mentioned the Marlon K. Jensen visit. That was a highlight of my time in Oakland. I was a new bishop. That was like 2013, I believe. So I'd been in for about a year, and he held a special fireside at the Berkeley Chapel, and it was to invite all friends, and everybody could come. And I invited some of my closest friends, evangelical Christian friends, to come and listen, and that with the promise that, hey, he's going to talk about church history. And he did. He apologized for the way that the church has treated the LGBTQ community, but he also apologized for the way that the church has treated Mormon history. And that was, I remember sitting there thinking, this is like he just said that.
Yeah.
He just said that things are going to change with the way that the church handles the history. And this is pre-essays, right? So obviously he was working on that. But it was an exciting moment to say, wow, somebody who represents the church just said, hey, we got some things wrong, and we're trying to do better, and we're going to treat history better going forward. And I remember that gave me a lot of hope because I wanted that, as every person in that fireside wanted.
And I'm not wanting to derail your story, Saane, but
No worries.
But there had to have been an important reason why Marlon K. Jensen chose Oakland.
Well,
and I'm guessing it has something to do with Carolyn Pearson. It has something to do with Dean Criddle. And it has something to do with the composition of the stake that would make it be that would make that be the place where Marlon Jensen would give such an important talk.
Yeah.
And all of that is just cultural context for your upbringing.
100%. I look back and I'm so grateful that I grew up in the area that I did, because it really allowed me to look through a lens of no longer just, representing the church, but really like what it means to understand and love humanity. That really growing up in that space and being around people and being around different perspectives was the perfect kind of this cultural melting pot for me to really get the most out of my experience. Yeah.
So, Saane, because both of your parents would have had sort of families before they came together, you would have had a lot of half-siblings or step-siblings.
Yeah, I have a huge blended family. Yeah.
So how many siblings did you grow up with in Oakland?
It's a great question. So I'm the oldest of four. So it's me, my brother, he's 25, and then I have two younger sisters, about 22, and one that's about to be 20. So I grew up mainly with them. In total, with all of my half siblings, because my dad had 2 marriages before my mom, 13. So 13 kids, 8 boys and 5 girls. My oldest sibling is about 53, 54. And so, like I said, my youngest is 20. So huge age range. So I grew up obviously with my 3 younger siblings and also my 2 older half siblings from my mom's previous marriage. And so my 2 older brothers, the 3rd one that my mom had with that previous marriage lived in New Zealand. And so I keep in touch with a good majority of like my siblings. But yeah, who I grew up with were mainly my 3 younger ones.
Okay. Yeah, so a blended family, lots of half siblings and step siblings. And it sounds like you and your 3 other siblings, even though your parents would have been older than many of your peers, it still feels like there might have been a sense of this contained traditional Mormon family, even though it was a blended family.
Oh, yes, 100%. Yeah, definitely a beautiful mixture of knowing what it means to be Tongan, seeing what that looks like, and being proud of that, and also being proud of being American as well. That was a huge 2-part cultural aspect that I grew up with, having immigrant parents. My mom only recently became a citizen up until, last year. And so, huge, obviously pride being a daughter of immigrants. That's a huge part of my identity and something that I grew up watching my parents kind of navigate what that looks like and what citizenship meant to them.
Yeah. Okay, so what are your fondest Mormon memories growing up as a pre-adolescent in Oakland, in a white ward as a child of Tongan immigrants?
Yeah. I think, Beau had brought this up earlier, testimony meetings. Every month, and I mean every month, my dad had us go up and bear testimony. So everybody knew that we would go up and bear testimonies. Me and my 3 younger siblings. My mom worked full-time as a caregiver, so she wasn't always able to come to church. So it was really like my dad was basically a stay-at-home dad. So I grew up with that kind of parental influence. And so the reason why I bring that up as a fond memory, I think I loved the idea. That's really what the act of bearing testimony, that's what taught me how to honestly, speak in public. That's what taught me how to share my beliefs. Obviously, that has changed over time, but I look back and I'm grateful that my dad stood up and had us stand up as well. That's something that I was really proud of. And I loved listening to my dad share his story time and time again. And my dad wasn't afraid. The word that I would use to describe my dad is fearless. And so that's something that I really admired growing up. So that was definitely one. Obviously, various experiences being a part of Young Women's was also another one. Really just like the community of sisterhood. That's something that I really appreciated and helped me figure out. Obviously, there were different things that weren't as helpful, but for the most part, really just having that community and having friendships that came out of that was something that I really cherished and was important to me in my upbringing.
Did y'all try and do the traditional family prayer, family home evening, family scripture study, all that stuff?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I would say the only thing that we were consistent with was probably family home evening. And even that we kind of struggled with. But yeah, that was probably the most consistent thing. Scripture study was kind of like done on our own here and there. But yeah, for the most part, family home evening. And of course, my dad would be the one to conduct that.
And did you adopt the practice of personal prayer and personal scripture study growing up?
Yes, growing up I did. Yeah.
Was that an important part of your Mormon upbringing, Mormon development?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think just not so much as like being the person that knew every scripture or knew every story. That wasn't necessarily as important to me, but more so what my relationship felt like with God and with Christ was what I drew to when it came to prayer.
And what did God and Christ mean to you as a kid growing up Mormon?
Yeah. When I think back to obviously now in my life being 26, I think of my activism and how so much of that was really tied back to my understanding of Christ and who he was to me. That was like the forefront of like, whether it was being accepting of my LGBTQ plus friends, whether it was understanding, Black history and standing up, to racist acts or things like that. At the forefront of why I did those things was my understanding of Christ.
What does Christ have to do with that stuff in your mind?
In my mind, I mean, obviously the question that, we hear, like, what would Jesus Christ do? What would he do? And so it was always the right thing and the morally right thing. And so that's what that meant to me in all of these different aspects of my life. And so, but overarching theme was trying to be like Christ.
So the right thing as it relates to marginalized groups, make that connection for me. I just want to know explicitly what you mean.
Yeah.
Christ would be what or do what with
marginalized
communities?
I mean, my understanding of Christ and who he was to me was someone who would advocate and did advocate for the most vulnerable populations and for the marginalized communities. And so for me, I mean, seeing my parents struggle being immigrants, me seeing, my queer friends struggling being accepted or friends of different religions. I had such a diverse group of friends growing up. And so, and a lot of that diversity, was tied to marginalization. And so seeing that and being exposed to that, that's what Christ meant to me, was someone who advocated for them, who wanted to uplift them. And that's what I wanted to do as well. So, yeah.
And your thoughts around Christ and the African American community, what would the connection there be?
Ooh, yeah.
Growing up.
Yeah, growing up, really, it came back to the civil rights movement. And obviously something that, I drew inspiration from was the history of like the Black Panthers, because they originated in Oakland. And a lot of people don't know this, but in New Zealand, Native Maoris, they were persecuted for being, from coming from their ethnic racial background against other, the white populations within New Zealand. And they actually adopted the model that the Black Panthers from Oakland, and they called themselves the Polynesian Panthers. And they led protests, they led demonstrations. No, this was in New Zealand.
Okay.
So, but I bring that up because I studied that history. So I studied Pacific Islanders who were activists, who were advocates for civil rights, human rights. And I saw Polynesian people around the world internationally that looked at, African Americans in the Black civil rights movement here in America. And so that was something that was very, making that connection for me at a young age was so key, was so important to me. And a huge reason of why I've always been a supporter of Black Menaces, which is why Nate is like one of my closest friends. I admire what they do and just seeing how that's kind of translated into my life now. it really comes back to tying that history, and again, adding the lens of being Mormon at the time, making that connection. I saw Christ in and the goodness that I felt from Christ and the advocacy. I saw that in the civil rights movement. I saw that in movements around the world where Polynesians were standing up for themselves and fighting for their own human rights.
So if I'm absorbing all this right, for you, Jesus Christ and Mormonism and the civil rights movement all belonged together and were well harmonized as...
Yes, growing up, yes. To me, that made sense to me. Because in my mind, it was just more so like, how could it not? If I believe in this so strongly, this has to work. Like, that was just my mindset as a young teenager growing up.
And you may or may not know that for my ears, those things don't fit together. In my ears, I was raised to believe that the civil rights movement was probably a bad thing, that Martin Luther King Jr. was probably a bad actor, and that Mormonism and the civil rights movement are like oil and water, and that race and people of color basically, that there's a lot of negative associations in my mind. So it's interesting, kind of a generational difference.
Right.
Where for you, it's like, of course, Jesus and Mormonism and civil rights and racial equality. And in my mind, it's like, whoa, those things may not all, one of these things is not like the other. But in your mind, they all were harmonized, and that's interesting.
100%.
Generationally.
For sure. And it also comes back to my dad as well. My dad was a huge revolutionary growing up in the islands. My dad saw, things that were, he saw greed affect how commoners and people that grew up in poverty, he saw that as injustice. And so my dad stood up to those things. And so having that background and that history, and seeing my dad being so obviously, quote unquote, active within the church, that kind of gave me a model of like, okay, I can be full force for this and also fight for what's right. Like that just, that's why I would also say it made sense for me in my head, with the context that I grew up in and my own family history. So
the questions that immediately spring to my mind are, were you not taught about the priesthood ban on people of African American descent within Mormonism? Were you not taught about Ezra Taft Benson and many other Mormon apostles opposing the civil rights movement and condemning Martin Luther King Jr.? Was that just never mentioned to you growing up? Was it not even an issue? Not to mention the Lamanite curse in the Book of Mormon. Not just with dark skin,
for sure,
but directly tied to Polynesians in my upbringing, in my Mormon upbringing, right? Was that just conveniently never mentioned to you or glossed over or reconciled in some way?
For sure. I would say it was never taught to me. And the little bits that were completely glossed over. Oh, yeah. Yes, I know Nate can back me up on this.
Did you want to say something, Nate?
Oh, yeah. Just everything was very, very manicured in the way that they taught things. So even teaching about the priesthood ban or, official declaration 2, everything was extremely manicured. And so they handled it with kid gloves in the way that they talked about it. And like, oh, well, this happened, but it's no big deal because this and this and this.
Exactly.
The church is still true, moving on. So it was never...
he's not the droid you're looking for, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
No, exactly what Nate said. Yeah, it was never taught to me, never brought up. It wasn't until my mission that I kind of opened the container and it all came out. So and that's probably why in my mind at the time it made sense, because there was nothing that was opposing what made sense to me, what was in harmony to me. Nothing, shattered that. And so for me, it made sense, and I kept going with it, and I kept moving forward with it.
Yeah, on the one hand, as someone who cares about the Mormon people, that's a show of progress, that just in a couple generations, I don't know, 1 or 2 generations between me and you, that like you can grow up and it's like race. Yeah, we're all, Heavenly Father loves all of us and Jesus is an advocate for all of us and we're all of equal status. on the one hand, as a Mormon, that shows so much progress within 2 generations. But then on the other hand, in my mind, it's like, whoa, that means for you, there's going to be some reckoning later in your story.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yes.
It's like, wait a minute, I wasn't told some of this stuff.
Yes.
But I guess I'm glad that you were able to have a Mormon experience where you felt fully loved and embraced and accepted.
Oh, yeah.
And you felt fully empowered, and like racial justice was compatible with an Orthodox Mormon upbringing. That makes me really happy.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, even at my high school, everybody knew that I was Mormon. That was not a secret. And that was not something that I hid. It was something that I wore with pride. And people knew that. And people respected that because they saw that, oh, so she's a Mormon and she has queer friends. Oh, she's a Mormon and, most of her friends are Black or from the Latinx community. And her herself, she's a woman of color. And so all these things, if anything, it shifted people's view of what they thought was Mormon.
Yeah.
It gave them a different idea of what, somebody from this religion and this church could be like. Yeah, people always joked that I would marry Jesus. Like that was just a thing. Obviously, don't think that at all. But people,
What did they mean by she's going to marry Jesus? What did they mean?
Because people, it's so embarrassing, but there was just like, I went to Northgate High School and there was this like couples page. This was like when Instagram first came out. And so they would pair people from my senior class together. And so they had paired me and literally the LDS Jesus picture. They posted me like half of like the picture was me, and then the other half was like white Jesus. Because I mean, people just perceived me as somebody who was so loving that the only person that would make sense was Jesus. Like nobody else in my school was like worthy enough, I guess.
Of Saane?
Or not good enough. I don't know. That was just like people's perspective. Obviously, I didn't date in high school either, so people just didn't see me in that, I guess, perspective or light. People were just like, no, she's untouchable, and she's so obviously religious and Christ-like. So pair her with Christ.
Were you bearing testimony about Jesus a lot? Were you did you wear your Christianity / Mormonism kind of on your sleeve as a high schooler? That's
a great question. I wouldn't say like I bore testimony per se, but really just like I was very intentional with how I treated people. I like for instance during lunch, obviously I had a central group of friends that I still keep in touch with to this day. But I mean, I would spend lunch with different groups of people. I was very intentional with making sure that people weren't ever alone.
Inclusion.
I was very intentional with that, whether it was, sitting with kids that listened to Screamo music, and I didn't like Screamo music, but I would listen to it with them just to have connection. I was very intentional with that. And I think that's a trait that I get from my dad. My dad's really good at just talking to everyone and whoever. And I loved doing that. I loved getting to know people and building connection and also just building friendship. And so, and I really tried to live by example, because that's what my dad did for me. The way that he lived by example and how he treated people, that to me was what I thought, Mormonism was about. What I thought about being a member, that's what that looked like to me. And so for me, I tried to do that as well in my upbringing, going from elementary school to high school.
How would you summarize your dad's beliefs and how people should be treated then? Just to put a fine point on it.
Yeah. I think treated with respect and with love.
No matter what their background.
No matter what. My dad is very good. Obviously, my dad may have very differing opinions, 100% from many people, from other people. But that never, my dad never used that as a reason to treat people poorly. He was always really adamant about treating people with kindness and with love and with respect. And I saw that, all the time.
What was your experience with the youth program in the church, both on the ward level and at the stake level? Things like young women's youth activities, mutual, I don't know what they called it.
Yeah, mutual. It was called mutual.
And then also ward and stake dances and youth conferences and all that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And seminary.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Did seminary all 4 years.
Was it just with your ward members or with your stake members?
No,
was it early morning?
It was early morning. So yeah, I had what was called an A period. So that was like a 7 a.m. class. So seminary was like 5:30, 6 a.m. For me. So I had seminary a bit earlier than like other people. Did that all 4 years. That was mostly with not necessarily ward members, but with members within my high school, if that makes sense. Because the high school that I went to was pretty far from the church that I went to. And so so seminary was with ward members from a completely different stake, but they went to the same high school that I did. Attended with my brother. We were a year apart, so we were obviously always in school together because we were just a grade apart. I went to mutual. So I was pretty active in terms of like attending various activities, did girls camp every year.
How'd you like girls camp?
Huh?
How'd you like girls camp?
Oh, I loved girls camp. I think something that girls camp gave me that like mutual and seminary activities didn't was just access and availability to different members of color. Again, I grew up around a heavily white membership. I was one of the very few members of color within my ward. And again, like I said, my family, we were the only Polynesian family and one of the few families of color like in our ward. And so there was always a feeling of like, you know, the white membership kind of looked to us to kind of represent like all the other brown people in the world, which was obviously not possible. Yeah, which was not possible. And so, yeah, I grew up around a very heavily white membership. But on the other side of that, also a very progressive white membership, I would say. And so that was also a two-part to how I grew up. And so, I mean, there were positive moments, but also really hard ones in terms of like, it was honestly growing up, it really made me really think about just the nuances and the layers of like being a woman of color, being Polynesian, being Pacific Islander, and what that meant. Like, for instance, when it came to the talk, like the idea of dating, in those conversations growing up in Young Women's, I never felt like that applied to me because there was always the standard of beauty was attached to whiteness. And so that was really hard for me. Growing up around that environment, there was a part where I was like really proud of this religion, but then there's other part of like the authentic parts of me and who I am also wasn't really truly accepted. And those are things that I try to reconcile growing up with, but was constantly clashing, if that makes sense.
Are you saying, I hope I'm not misunderstanding this. Are you saying that within Mormon culture, you didn't feel a sense of beauty associated with you?
100%, yeah.
And then that affected how you thought about yourself as it related to courtship and dating? Oh,
yes. I mean, when you think about young men's and young women's, we talk about marriage. Like, that was like something that we talked about so often. And so when I think about my upbringing in the church, and I don't know if this was your experience, Nate, but at least for me, growing up in the church and being as active as I was, marriage was such a focal point of like, that's what we're working towards. Mm-hmm. Families, like eternal families, like you have to get there in order to have an eternal family. And even like I was 12 when my family was sealed in the Oakland Temple. So I remembered my sealing because obviously my dad had to annul his sealing from his previous wife after he was obviously, got married to my mom. And so that took a number of years, almost a decade before me and my family were able to go into the temple and get sealed. And so those things heavily influenced the ideas in my mind of like, what was the, most important goal. And so for me, seeing that and being bombarded with those messages, but then also being bombarded with the messages that I didn't fit the standards of beauty. People weren't asking me out on dates. When I went to stake or ward dances, people weren't asking me to dance. They were asking the white girls to dance. Those are things that I noticed growing up. And then again, that's a whole other conversation in terms of like race and standards of beauty and all those all that jazz.
But how did you make sense of that? And how do you make sense of it now? Why wouldn't the white Mormon kids be asking you to dance as much as the white girls?
I mean, really it comes down to, their exposure. Again, like I said, I was around white membership pretty much for most of my Mormon experience. And so they were too. They didn't see people that looked like me a lot, even at the schools that I went to, majority white students. And so their standards of beauty were contingent upon who they were seeing, what media they had access to, and who they were seeing in media, which again, mostly white people. And so, I think there's obviously systemic levels down to the local levels of just different influences that affected their perception of beauty and what that looked like, and just lack of exposure, lack of proximity, are probably all reasons that I would say that would attribute to it. How did I reconcile that?
Because what you're saying is the white boys wouldn't ask you to dance as much as they would other white girls, and the white Mormon boys wouldn't ask you out on dates. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, for sure. 100%.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so
I experienced that at BYU as well. So yes, that's definitely what I'm saying. I didn't know if you wanted me to clarify that.
And so you were about to say how that felt for you growing up in this ward and stake.
Yes, for sure. I think for a long time, there was the idea in my head, again, the same reason why people, paired me with Jesus, like this idea that I didn't really see myself in the context of marriage, because that didn't seem possible to me. I saw that being possible for other people. Even seeing young couples that, were recently married, that just graduated BYU, that would come to my ward, I would see that often, and I didn't see myself in that. And so for me, it was just more so I poured myself into education and maintained my focus on that and less about the idea of marriage. That's what got me through high school, is what I mean. That specific time period.
Did it make you sad? Did you feel left out? Did you feel, I don't want to say ugly because that sounds rude, but did it make you feel less attractive, less desired?
For sure, 100%. And especially with my parents, they also had this idea that, if you married a white man, or if, they attached, success with whiteness.
Your parents did?
Yes, of course, yeah. Same reason, it goes back to, why we went to a white ward. So my parents attached, the two together. And so, yeah, they would try to set me up here and there. But again,
with white boys.
Yes. By trying, they would bring up the name. They didn't actually hey, go ask out my daughter. That never happened. Thank goodness it didn't. But yeah, in terms of how that felt, of course that felt sad. And I don't think I really processed it at the time. Like I said, I really tried to, I think what I tried to do in order to cope with that was really just distract myself. But yeah, when I look back, I obviously have a lot of compassion and sadness for that version of myself. Because I just, I should have never felt that way in those environments, but I did. But obviously now, being much older, I look back and wish I didn't feel that way, and wish that I, not only accepted, not only just how I physically looked, but also my culture and what that came with, and not degrade that because of other people's perception. Or lack thereof, I guess.
So I want to see if I understand. So being raised by Tongan immigrant Mormon parents, are you saying you were raised with the feeling that the ideal for them would have been for you to marry a white Mormon boy / return missionary?
I would say part of that. I don't think it was necessarily the end all be all goal that they had for me, but if it were to happen, to them it would mean, oh, she'll be set.
Kind of she would have arrived.
Yes, exactly. But yeah, I don't think it was more so you have to marry a white person, but it was just more so if that were to happen, that would mean added success to your life.
Because what I'm also imagining is that, Mormon Tongans / Samoans / Polynesians within the Bay Area would still know about lots of other families.
Oh, yes.
And I could have imagined your parents saying, hey, there's this cute Tongan boy over in X ward or the Polynesian stake, and trying to set you up with either preferably Tongan, if not Polynesian, boys to date during your Mormon adolescence. But you're saying that wasn't a thing?
No, that wasn't.
Do you have a sense for why that wasn't a thing?
I think a lot of it just has to do with, I guess, like the stereotypes that came to, you know, Tongan boys, or I guess Polynesian boys just growing up.
That your parents held.
Oh, yeah, 100%. I mean, there's a few percentage of them that pursue higher education. Obviously, you know, they're the few, you know, the stereotypes that come with like Polynesian boys. They'll either go into sports, football, rugby, basketball, and whereas my parents didn't really see that as like a ticket to success. Some did. But again, like I said, my dad was very big about education. And so for him, it was more so like, you need to be with someone who cares about education just as much as I do and just as much as you do. And that wasn't typical. That wasn't typical of a lot of Tongan boys growing up. Education wasn't at the forefront of what they wanted to do, what they were passionate about. And so my parents were just more so like, stray away from anyone that doesn't care about education.
And what I'm hearing, and this is delicate stuff, and I appreciate your vulnerability. What I'm hearing you say is your parents were unique as Tongan immigrants, the extent to which they valued education.
Yes.
But then there's a rub to that, which is to say that other Tongan/Polynesian Mormon families didn't tend to value education like your parents.
I would say so, 100%.
How do you make sense of, and I guess you wouldn't be able to represent other Tongan and Samoan
of course
Mormon families, but I would just say, why wouldn't they value education as much as your parents did?
I mean, that's a great question. And then again, that's not to say that there aren't families out there. There are plenty of families, Polynesian families, Pacific Islander families that do and value education very much. I think at least within the area that I grew up with and the families that I grew up around, a lot of their parents, it was a generational thing. When it came to like obviously having grown up in poverty, they didn't have the time to go to school. They were worrying about making money and surviving and bringing back food for their families. So school wasn't a priority. It could have been had they had access, you know, to resources and financial stability, but because there was a lack of that, school just wasn't a priority. I mean, a lot of my aunts and uncles, at least for my dad, and a mixture of my mom's side, that was their story. They dropped out of middle school to work full time to support their families. And so because of that, it kind of just, you know, now you have parents that barely have a middle school, high school education, and they're trying to get their kids to go to school, but then it's just like they don't know how to do that because they never had that experience themselves. And so there's obviously, you know, the financial instability that I would say is a huge reason as to why other families, it's not that they didn't want to value education, they just couldn't at some point. And that kind of generationally just trickled down into obviously younger generations. Whereas like with my dad was very fortunate. He grew up in poverty, but his uncle moved him to the capital, which is considered a more, you know, wealthier area, much more access to better education, better schools. And so my dad was very fortunate to have grown up in that area where my dad took advantage of education. And so, and obviously you have people that, you know, maybe they don't care about school as well. That was also true for some of my family members. They didn't look at school as the only way to find success. So,
and I guess this is why we need other Tongans and Samoans to come on Mormon Stories to tell stories from their perspective, because there are landmines in this conversation we're having, but I think it's important.
100%.
So I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Nate, I'm curious if any of what this conversation about education and belonging and race within a Mormon context, if there's any of this that's hitting you in any way, or that you're resonating with, if there's anything that kind of jumps out to you about Saane's experience. That feels familiar or not familiar?
You know, when talking about the beauty standards and things like that, I was just kind of thinking about how it's interesting how my brain works, because my, growing up, I always had a pretty good idea of like my identity as far as being a Black person, but as far as like what that meant, I wasn't necessarily there all the way. But when you talked about not getting asked to dance at stake dances, I just kind of made me think about how I used to like make it a point to ask like women of color to dance at those. So whenever I saw a Black girl at a stake dance or whatever, I always like made it a point to go and ask her to dance. And I was just kind of like thinking about why I did that. Because where I was mentally and like the things that I thought about, even though there was a lot of conflict there with my identity, I still like always had the idea that I would be with a Black woman. Like that was always my, like, when we talked about marriage and things like that, it was always kind of like, well, I don't know when I'm going to get married, but when I do, I know it'll be to a Black woman, So I was just kind of thinking about that in my head and like what triggered that particular idea.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
I grew up in such an interesting environment. It was like a very white environment. But that was just kind of always there. And I think that, that had a lot to do with like my parents and the identity, the Black identity that they put in me at a young age. But then also like where I thought about everything else was I thought about it in like a very white mindset, or like, my religious beliefs, my political beliefs, a lot of that was shaped by like the whiteness that I was surrounded with in the church. So I've been thinking about that. It's kind of interesting.
No, yeah.
I mean, now going back to the Mormonism that I was raised with and that maybe Beau was raised with as well, I mean, if you go back into the 60s and 70s, it was taught that it was evil for races to mix, right? That you can go back to Brigham Young's time where he says that like there can be, death, like murder, death penalty is okay for someone who mixes the seed, who mixes the races. So like interracial marriage was like condemned in 19th century and early to mid 20th century Mormonism in a very serious way. But then
even more recently than that too.
What's that?
I said even more recently than that too. I remember listening to like some BYU devotionals and it was much more coded, but I can't remember who it was. I want to say it was Elder Holland or maybe it was Elder Hinckley. But they said, if you come from such and such background, you should marry somebody from such and such background. If you come from this background, you should marry someone from that background. And it didn't say race, but it talked about religion and like socioeconomic status and stuff like that. It talked about like you stick, whoever it was that was saying that, they said it in a BYU devotional.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm trying to say there were times where it was like explicitly condemned as horrible for races to mix within Mormonism. Let's just say prior to the 1980s and 90s. And then once the priesthood ban was lifted and Mormonism started to really come into the 21st century in terms of trying to not be super overtly racist, even up until the past few years, and probably even up until this year, you could still find quotes or passages in Mormon Sunday school curriculum, gently encouraging people to kind of stay within their cultural background, which is coded language for no interracial marriage, right?
Yes.
And so it is interesting for me, Nate, to hear that your sense growing up was that you would end up with a Black woman who was Mormon. But then for you, it was like marrying the white guy was going to be the pinnacle of your success.
Yeah, I had no really picture, not as strong as Nate's, that's for sure, on what that would look like. Because in my mind, I had both Tongan parents, Tongan dad and a Tongan mom, but I was never encouraged or really shown that I would marry Tongan man. That was never at the forefront. So it was kind of this weird like mystery question mark. I don't know what that looks like for me, really growing up.
And it sounds like you channeled that into religiosity and academic excellence.
Yes.
And sort of just like hibernated that whole romantic dating sort of part of yourself.
For sure. 100%. Yeah, that was definitely something that I definitely, like the word that you used, did hibernate and did really put on the back burner. It was, and again, for most of my upbringing into high school, it was just something that did not seem possible because it wasn't possible to me growing up, and so it became less important to me, I would say, and more about my own personal women empowerment and focusing on what it meant to be an activist growing up as a teenager, and having this religion on my sleeve and showing it. Those became more important to me, and so I definitely put that on the back burner and didn't try to not think about it, for sure.
And as I'm thinking about teenage Saane, like, on the one hand, I'm like, that's great. She's not wasting her time with all this silliness. She's getting her education. She's becoming a social justice advocate and getting a great education. There's a part of me that's like, that sounds amazing. And then on the other hand, those teen years are really important developmental years to date, to court, to have boyfriends or girlfriends, to kiss or make out, or to have breakups and to learn what love, to start to learn what love is. And I guess that it sounds like that really wasn't available to you in what some would say is a very important developmental stage.
Oh yeah, for sure. It definitely wasn't.
And there's probably a cost. There's probably a benefit to that, and maybe a cost to that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, 100%. There was a benefit to it. Exactly like you said. It helped me stay focused. I was focused on goals of mine, pursuing, my dreams of accessing higher education. So, I mean, yeah, the pro of that was that it, allowed me to be more focused. I didn't have distractions, quote unquote. But obviously, on the other hand of that, a con was obviously I did lack that experience. I didn't. There's also, the aspect of also, a lack of self-love that also affected me going into college, where dating became even more apparent, even more important.
What do you mean lack of self-love? Talk about teen Saane, like lack of self-love.
Yes, teen Saane. Whew, lack of self-love.
What's not the love?
I think when I go back to that time, my mindset was really just, truthfully, that I wasn't worthy of marriage, that I wasn't worthy of that kind of love, because people didn't show me, or at least teach me that I was, quite honestly. And I think a lot of that just had to do with my level of proximity to, again, white membership and people that didn't look like me. I didn't have access to people that looked like me and that were dating, or that did get married or did have children. I didn't see that other than within my own cocoon of my family. And even that was hard, because they were more so, oh yeah, you don't need to worry about that. That'll come in time. But again, it was just lots of mixed messages. But before I go on, Nate, did you have a thought? I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you think that for a lot of people who immigrate to the United States and who are members of the church, that whiteness is kind of the standard? And that probably makes a difference in how you grew up. You know what I mean? I feel like, I think about my situation, it was kind of unique. But when I think about a lot of the other Black people that I know who are members of the church, most of them are immigrants, right?
Yes.
And for them, a lot of times whiteness is the standard. So they'll immigrate to the United States, and then the goal is to become as close to that white ideal as possible. So it's seek out education at in the best places to live, in the whitest neighborhoods, to marry a white person, and just kind of have that proximity to whiteness. I feel like that kind of becomes the standard.
For sure. That's a great question. And I think you put it perfectly in that sense where, it really was attributing it back to whiteness. And you'll see that. I've seen that myself across many immigrant, Polynesian families, Pacific Islander families, kind of this, like you said, this end goal of, success and getting close to whiteness. So yeah, for sure, that definitely affected my experience in the way that I viewed myself. But it's weird because I mean, like, it's this weird thing where it's just like my parents were also. It's like they picked and chose when they were really proud to be Tongan, and then also different times where they. Not that they wish that they were white, but they attributed whiteness as higher than being Tongan. So it was kind of this mix of like, I'm proud to be Tongan, but also go white people, like, And so for me, growing up, it was very much like, but I'm proud to be Tongan. I'm glad that I'm not white. Like that was my own personal ideology growing up. I was proud to be Tongan, and so it was weird seeing my parents kind of shift back and forth between this ideal of like white nationalism or whiteness and success and prosperity or whatnot, because I didn't agree with that growing up. I was always proud to be Tongan, and I didn't want to be anything else. It was just more so, why does this feel inferior sometimes when it shouldn't, or less than?
Saane, I don't know what that experience is like, but I do see how, in some ways, this idea of like seeing the leaders and the most educated or the well-off people, that they were white, that they're on the stand.
Right.
There is this thing, right? Like last Sunday, we went to a Sudanese ward in Salt Lake, and I was really excited to go. My daughter was singing in the ward, and so we were guests there, and seeing families of Sudanese, nationality, like coming into church and in their gorgeous dresses, and like it was so cool. And then we sat there and we stayed for sacrament meeting and for testimony meeting. Not one Sudanese person is in leadership. Okay?
Yeah.
One Sudanese person gave their testimony. All the rest were imports. They were people with more experience, I would imagine. White people, a Polynesian person, a Latino person, but not Sudanese people. And I just found that interesting, and I've seen that in other, especially on my mission, serving in Latin communities, Latino communities, where a new branch would start or a new ward would start, and they would import a bishop to come in, essentially show them how to do it, right?
Right.
The
it's
leadership.
Kind of babysit.
Yeah, and it feels kind of like babysitting. And then similar with what senior missionaries are doing now, where a lot of senior missionaries are getting called not necessarily on proselytizing missions, but more leadership missions, right? Where they're going to certain areas, certain wards, and showing them how to do things right. And so I think that even though you were proud of your Tongan heritage and should be, there's also this subliminal, like, why is it, right? Like the first Polynesian General Authority was like 10 years ago.
Exactly.
Right? So when you look up on the stand and you don't see yourself represented, I would imagine that there's somewhat of a disconnect there on kind of who you see yourself as, the goals that are being set as aspirations. What do you do with that?
Exactly. Yeah. No, yeah. I appreciate that, because that's exactly, just looking up at the stand, even my young women leaders being white women, that didn't help me, find, standards of beauty within myself, because, again, there's just that lack of representation. And also my mom worked full time. She didn't come to church with us. And so I just, lacked that, female and womanhood, presence, and being a woman of color, that just was not a part of my experience growing up, LDS.
So that makes me want to ask, like, if the Mormon Church has this long, multi-generational history with Polynesia and with Tonga and Samoa specifically, you would think then that the church would have had area and general authorities from Tonga and Samoa for many, many decades.
Yeah, you would think.
And that's not what happened?
No, that's not the case at all.
So the first Polynesian area or general authority was when and who?
General authority. I can't remember his name. I have his face in my mind.
But it would have been 10 years ago?
Yeah, about that time.
Yeah, that's what I remember. It was about 10 years ago, and I believe he was Hawaiian. But I'll look him up.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that would have been in 2013.
Yeah, 2023. Yeah.
Okay. So you're not seeing, not only are you not seeing young women or young men leaders in your ward who represented you, not in your bishopric, and then not at the leadership levels of the church either.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very white, as we all know.
Was your dad ever called into the bishopric while you were growing up?
No.
Okay.
No, he was not. Always talked about wanting to serve in a higher position, but was never called.
Yeah. And I guess, Beau, you can speak about how her family was perceived within the ward, possibly.
Yeah, absolutely. So 2 sides to that. We absolutely love the Siale family. Like every baptism we ever had, every convert baptism, we always wanted them to sing, always wanted them to perform, always wanted them to be part of that. Like they brought this like very special spirit to our meetings. And like I can never remember once even it crossing my mind that there was any kind of like, oh, we want to bring in more like culture or non-white people into this. Like it literally never crossed my mind. But also it never crossed my mind to call Brother Siale as a counselor during my 5 years. You know, and why is that? And I think that's a good question for me to ask. And I don't know why. He is a bit of a live wire.
Yeah.
Okay. Like now that I think about it, like, you know, when you're teaching Sunday school or high priest or elders quorum or whatever, and Brother Siale always sits on the back, right? And this is what Brother Siale looks like. Right? The whole time until you call on him, he's raising his hand to make a comment that generally goes 5 to 10 minutes. And so, you know.
Yeah, sounds like my dad.
And very opinionated and oftentimes very right wing.
Yes.
Which was appreciated by some people in our ward and not appreciated by some people in our ward.
Which I totally get.
And so I think that, this conversation is just so good to have because even people like me, who I very much felt like one of my roles as bishop was to be a progressive bishop, right? Like radical inclusivity. I never even asked myself these questions in that position.
Right.
And why, you know, these kind of conversations are so important to have is because, you know, it allows us to ask ourselves these questions and look at these things.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about teenage Saane now, and on the one hand, you're proud of your Tongan heritage. You love your parents dearly.
Yes.
And you love yourself, and you're raised with this idea that whiteness somehow is the best, and that somehow courtship and even marriage, you're not seeing how you fit into that.
For sure.
And yet you're not really taught about, and it's not really overtly discussed, the priesthood ban, the dark skin curse in the Book of Mormon.
Right.
And how Mormonism has this multi-century legacy of racism. Right?
Yes.
So you're experiencing that racism, but it's never talked about explicitly, and the history is never really acknowledged.
Yes, 100%.
That's mind-blowing to me.
Me too. I guess.
Yeah.
No, it is mind-blowing because that's where a little bit of the betrayal comes in. I use the word betrayal intentionally because it was, like I mentioned previously, it wasn't until my mission that I actually studied the priesthood ban. And I remember just feeling like so blindsided. Like, here I am. I'm already on the mission. I'm already out in the field. And I'm supposed to be this representative of Christ. And yet there's this ugly history that I am just now coming to learn about. And I'm supposed to be here and bring people into this church with this history that I'm just now learning about and finding out. That was a huge clash for me during that time because it made me rethink everything. It made me go back to my upbringing, and some of my closest friends from high school are Black, but
not LDS.
But not LDS for sure. But they always admired, who, like, my example to them of a Mormon, of somebody that was LDS, because I was so welcoming and open to people of different races, of different ethnic backgrounds. And so to think that, people, leaders, from this religion and church did not accept, and if anything were demeaning, degrading, and racist, plain out racist, was just very, I couldn't make sense of it at the time. It was so much to process. And I remember bringing it up with, a sister training leader at the time on my mission, and she told me to never bring it up again. She didn't even answer the question that I asked her. She just told me to not bring it up. And
what'd you ask?
I just asked her, like, did she know about this? About the priesthood ban? So Black people in the priesthood, and
she was white.
She was white.
Okay.
Yes, she was white. She was from Utah, and yeah, she told me to never bring it up again. And if anything, she made me feel like I was dumb for asking. I felt dumb for asking. I felt ashamed for even bringing it up. But then there was that fire within me where it's just like, why are we not talking about this? And I remember we had this huge meeting on my mission, and somebody had brought up, how do we answer when people say that, our church is racist? And I don't even remember what my mission president said or what was shared or the advice or counsel that was given. But it just brought me back to, see, this is why we need to talk about this, because I don't blame people for seeing this church as racist. That was my thinking at the time during my mission. And so, yeah, lots of things there.
So rewinding to, let's just say you're graduating high school.
Yeah.
Like, I think about your parents, and they want the best education and the healthiest outcome for you as one of their kids.
Yeah.
And I'm imagining they're checking the box of, like, we chose to bring our family to a white ward in Oakland and to have our kids be raised amongst white people religiously and educationally.
Yeah.
For the most part. And by the time you're graduating, I'm guessing that from your parents' perspective, they're checking all the boxes.
Yes.
Did you do well in high school?
Yes, I did. Yeah, I graduated with a 4.0. So for them, it was like the holy grail. Like, I did it all, and now I'm going to continue my path at BYU. So obviously I had gotten accepted into BYU, so they already knew that was like my next chapter post-graduation of high school.
So, like, not only no teen pregnancy for Saane from your parents' perspective.
Yeah, nope.
But did super well. Didn't even have to worry about her getting in trouble with boys from their perspective.
Yeah.
Got straight A's. So, like, close to valedictorian maybe, or in your...
I mean, I wouldn't say close. I mean, yeah, I did well in school. I had straight A's throughout high school, so that was never an issue academically.
But got into BYU,
got
which
into BYU.
Would be a huge accomplishment from your parents' perspective.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And did you get a scholarship to BYU?
Yes. So, yeah.
So, I mean, that's like, for your parents' perspective, that's like straight A's. They're super proud and happy about the decisions they made.
For sure, 100%.
And it all turned out, that turns out well. Those decisions.
Right. It almost proved to them that this is why we did these things for you, is to, now you've made it, and this is why.
It's almost like the gospel is true, because look at how well Saane has done, right?
Yeah, 100%.
The Mormonism's true. We raised Saane Mormon, and even as white Mormon as we could, and look how well she's doing.
For sure. Oh, yeah. That was definitely kind of like their own pats on the back. Like, we did well as parents. And obviously, I'll never deny that. They did do well to the best of their abilities. It's interesting. At the same time, there's so much that my parents are so unaware of that they kind of just expected me to do well. But, like, the work that it took to get there was a lot. Like, even when it came to applying for scholarships, applying for school, those are things that, I mean, I'm also first gen, so first generation college student and college graduate. So that whole entire process I was doing by myself. Obviously, I had the verbal, emotional support from my parents, but the logistics of what that looked like, that path was very lonely.
For you?
For sure. Yeah. For me. Yeah.
Why was that lonely?
Just more so the added pressure of like, you'll do this, A, B, C, D. And for me, it's just like, well, where do I even start? Where do I go? Who do I ask for help? I'm the old, and I was the oldest. I was the oldest child, and so I was kind of the guinea pig in a lot of my experiences.
So your parents were like, "Here's how to apply to BYU." That wasn't a conversation.
No, they weren't even a part of that process. That application process. I attended a program called SOAR, which stands for Summer of Academic Refinement. It is a program for juniors in high school. It's run by the Multicultural Student Services Office at BYU, and so they kind of recruit for students of color to come to this. It's like an ACT prep camp kind of thing, but also you kind of get to do fun activities with other LDS members of color from different parts of the states. I attended that my junior year of high school, and so I was about 14. I would say 14, 15. And so that was my first introduction to BYU. I took the ACT there, did pretty well, established relationships with people that work at BYU that were people of color. It was kind of like my first introduction to like, wow, I'm in a room full of brown people that are also LDS. I never had that like experience previous to that. And so that was my introduction to BYU. And yeah, that whole process of applying and whatnot was something that I did on my own.
Mm. And so I guess I'm trying to balance as I'm trying to understand your upbringing. You were raised as white and as white Mormon as your parents as Tongan immigrants could possibly raise you. And I guess there's a duality there of like self-loathing and racism that you experienced and, I don't know, cultural imperialism. I don't know exactly how to characterize the negatives of that upbringing. Yeah, there's layers
to it, yeah.
But then there's all the positives of like you had an amazing outcome in terms of you not just going to college as the first in your generational family to go to college, but on scholarship.
Yeah.
So there's this duality of negatives and positives that I'm trying to struggle with and say, which is it, more positive or more negative? It seems more positive. Like how many of those other Tongan or Samoan families growing up in the Bay Area would have wanted the outcome that your parents were able to achieve by raising you as white and as Mormon as possible?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think about like my educational and career path, and I think of other Tongans, people from back home. I can't think of a lot of other people, honestly, from my upbringing, from my community, my Tongan community. I'm one of the very few from where I come from that has a degree that is pursuing higher education. There's just obviously just a lack of representation overall. And yeah, there definitely is a duality. There is, the positive and the negatives. That's something that I kind of wrestle with back and forth, because there are parts of me where I wish I did grow up around more Tongan people. I wish I would have experienced what it would have felt like to go to church and see a room full of people that looked like me. There are parts of me that wish that I did have that experience, but didn't. And so, again, there's kind of like this grief for what it would have looked like to be surrounded by my culture and have that be at the forefront of what success looks like, and not necessarily attributing it back to whiteness, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
And I will add to this my perspective on watching the Siale family, raise their kids the way that they did. So brothers and sisters Siale are amazing people. Like they really are just really big personality, amazing people. Like everybody loves them. And the idea that Saane was raised in the town that she was in a predominantly white area, white ward, white school, I'm sure that had an effect. Okay. But I do also want to flag that Saane really was an adult from age 12 on, like raising her siblings. Okay. Her mom worked full-time in home care. So nights, weekends, days. Okay. And her dad was in his 70s. Saane was essentially the caretaker of her 3 younger siblings throughout her entire growing up years, especially in the high school years. And then you go to church on Sunday, and there's Saane as Laurel class president or whatever, and simultaneously on the cover of the Oakland Tribune as an activist marching in the streets, her and her sister, right, marching in the streets for civil liberties. And so this world of dualities, like, yes, I'm sure there was influence in them raising their family where they did, but also, yes, it was Saane and her role as a leader from a very young age is, I think, also part of the reason that you have become who you've become.
100%.
Right?
Yeah.
Educated, powerful, voice, like these attributes that are you. You've kind of always been that way.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Just you and yourself. Like you are that person.
Thank you.
And so it's, I don't know. I don't want to attribute so much to the area that she was, raised in. I know that was very influential, but also just you are who you are and always have been that way.
100%. Yeah. And again, like I said, I mentioned like my closest friendships were not white people. My closest friendships were people from, different ethnic, racial backgrounds, different sexualities, different gender. I like one of my first experience with trans people was a friend in high school. I was exposed to so many different communities, but that never shook my identity as a member at the time, because I was so open and welcoming to the idea of people from all different walks of life. And like you said, that was something that I always led with, being the oldest and wanting to be that example. And I wanted to show people that you can do both, as I had hoped during that time, obviously, that you can be this activist and actually, care about human rights and civil rights and also believe in Christ. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. So what were you doing social justice-wise in high school on top of helping to raise your 3 other siblings and being a devout Mormon girl and becoming the equivalent of almost a valedictorian? How was social justice how did you have time for social justice, and what were you doing?
I made time for that.
So talk about how you would even have time and why.
Again, it goes back to me in my history class, my U.S. history class, and studying the civil rights movement. And being exposed to people like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Coretta Scott King, the Black Panther movement, so many people, Angela Davis, like those were like names that I knew from a very young age. And
from high school history classes?
Yeah, middle school, high school. Yeah. I had an amazing history teacher. She was actually queer herself, and she was very open about that. And she even, spent a whole week on curriculum of like Native American and indigenous people. And so I'm really grateful for those teachers that really cared to talk about history. Do
you want to say her name, the teacher that was particularly influential?
Yeah, Miss Leahy.
Okay.
Yeah, Miss Leahy.
And what grade was that?
This was, I don't even remember.
Okay, that's fine.
9th grade? 9th or 10th. In high school, at least.
Talk just briefly about you're reading, you're taking these classes, or you're reading these textbooks or whatever.
Yeah.
What's occurring to you? You're like, oh my gosh, what about our history?
Yes. I really think that was integral to my experience because it opened my eyes to U.S. history, like American history in general.
And you're discovering what when you start reading it? That what?
Oh, just, the ugly past that we have and still have and how that's affected us today. I mean, again, in Tongan culture, we have this mindset where, we honor those that came before us and those who came today and create a path for those to come. that's a huge central part of being Polynesian, of being Tongan, is honoring those before, here today, and then those to come, making a path for those to come. And I bring that up because that's how I viewed history. That's how I viewed U.S. history. What happened before us? What happened before me? And so for me, I looked. Obviously, I'm not related to Black people from the civil rights movement, but I looked to them as like my ancestors before me, who paved a path for a person of color like me today. And for me, I had this mindset of like, what am I doing for those to come after me in the future?
You mentioned Coretta Scott King or Rosa Parks. Maybe you didn't mention her, or Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah, I mentioned Malcolm X. Yeah, Angela Davis.
I don't know if Julio Cesar Chavez was part of that.
Yeah, for sure. Cesar Chavez. And I think the Chicano movement, for sure. All of those things.
And as a teen, how did you connect to them in terms of what they did for you?
Yeah. How I connected to them, well, for one, it was really just empathizing with like what they were fighting for, understanding how unjust it was. That the racism that they experienced, the segregation, the lynching, the brutality of what, the enslavement of Africans did, and the legacy that left for Black Americans today. All of that in my mind, it was seeing this bigger picture of like, here I was growing up in my Tongan home and my dad talking about this American dream. But for me, I'm looking at U.S. history with this wider lens and thinking to myself, where is the American dream in this? Those were the questions that I was asking myself and posing to myself at that time. And being exposed to that, for me, it made me want to learn more. It made me want to understand, like, why did we allow this to happen? Why was this considered okay and legal, or whatever word you want to use? Why was this morally okay for people to commit these acts of whether it was sexual violence, physical violence, all of that, A through Z? Why was that? Why did that happen? The same way that I look at the Holocaust. Like, why did these things happen? How did it get to that point? Those are things that, kind of drew me to understanding all of these different movements, and really connect that to why am I now allowed to go to school where, it's majority white people? At some point that would have never been allowed. So those were the kinds of connections.
Because of segregation.
Exactly, because of racial segregation. And so those were the connections that I was making, that there is a reason why things are the way that they are right now. That was the constant connection that I was consistently making with myself, while also understanding, this background and this history. And I didn't want to view it from a lens of the white man or the white person. I wanted to hear from people themselves, people that experience, these atrocities themselves. And so that's what led me to studying more and listening to more and reading books by, these different activists, different leaders.
So you felt sad and or outraged at the way people of color, and specifically African Americans, have been treated in American history.
Of course, yeah.
But also you felt gratitude for the civil rights leaders in the United States that had paved a way to allow you to have maybe a better experience.
Exactly, 100%. There was a sense of anger and frustration that was even like fathomable. It's still unfathomable to me, but the fact that happened was, there's so much anger and that I was processing as a teenager, but also so much admiration that how people fought back and how, African Americans did, stand up. And I admired that. And I was so inspired by that. And I would say the same for, different communities. Like I think about the Chicano movement and also, the Latin American history. And also I think of Native Americans and indigenous people, and also Native Hawaiians and what they experienced, which is a history that is often not talked about and not well known. And so all of those things were things that I was learning about and kind of absorbing, and really thinking to myself, like, where do I want to be in terms of history? And so, yeah, that's what influenced really that kind of period of my life in terms of activism. Even within my high school, there was actually a proposition that was trying to be passed to actually, basically, what it meant is that it would segregate students that came from lower socioeconomic families away from students that came from higher socioeconomic families. There was a parent group, and they felt adamantly about how their children couldn't learn in the best way with students that came from these kinds of lower socioeconomic backgrounds, which is obviously outrageous. But that was a legitimate thing that was trying to be passed. And my sister and I came together with like different teachers at the time who also disagreed with that. My dad was the last person to speak at the final council meeting. That was when they were going to vote to pass it or not. After my dad spoke, and he basically bore testimony of his story of why he came to America. And it's crazy because an hour after that public council meeting, the board of members unanimously voted against it. And so thankfully it didn't pass. But that was a legitimate thing that, my family was a part of in trying to fight against. And again,
it was even up for consideration at all.
Exactly. And it's crazy because you think about like, that would have meant students like me, my siblings. If that had passed, we wouldn't have been able to attend that school anymore. And solely for the fact that my parents don't meet a certain income bracket, that's crazy. But that was people's legitimate thinking that we would learn better separated. And so obviously it didn't pass, thankfully. But again, this was back in 2016, 2017. My sister and my brother were still in high school at the time. I had already graduated by that time. I graduated in 2015. But yeah, huge example of like what that looked like, me making time for activism because I experienced it. This was something real that would have affected my educational experience had that passed and had that been put into effect.
Really quickly, I remember being raised in Texas a few decades before you, feeling okay to respect Martin Luther King Jr., even though parts of my Mormonism were still telling me that he was a bad actor. But I also remember being taught that the Black Panthers were bad and that Martin Luther King Jr. That Malcolm X was bad.
Yeah.
So Black Panthers, let me start over. Black Panthers and Malcolm X bad, Martin Luther King Jr. good from a secular perspective, but questionable from a Mormon perspective. How was it for you?
They were all good to me. I never
by your teachers.
I wouldn't necessarily say like my teachers, but just for me, it's so crazy because like I didn't grow up with that Mormonism history or where they're pitting Malcolm X as the devil and Martin Luther King as the angel against each other. I never grew up with that understanding. I viewed all of them, I revered all of them with sacred respect for what they did.
Including the Black Panthers?
Including the Black Panthers.
Explain that, because from white America, they were violent.
Yeah,
you know
I'm
what
sure
I mean?
it made a difference, like being where they were from too. I think that made a difference as well.
Yeah, being from the East Bay, being from Oakland Bay area, I was very aware of issues at the time, police brutality. Also 2015, like around that time, that's when Black Lives Matter was gaining momentum. And again, I also had really close Black friendships who were vulnerable with me about their experiences, where, one experience in particular is driving with my friend who happens to be Black, and there was a police car that had driven by and she froze. She froze in her passenger seat and she was so scared. And I remember thinking like, wow, just the presence of police instills fear in you. And I remember having a very vulnerable and deep conversation with her. And again, just things like that in my life, being exposed to that, it opened my eyes to this grander perspective outside of whiteness. It allowed me to see white supremacy and white nationalism and racism for what it was. There was no hiding it, no confusing it. Like, I saw it for what it was, and that made me angry. That frustrated me. And so I just feel like from a young age, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, like there was no like comparing. It was just like, obviously they like handled things differently. But I mean, I read excerpts where, Martin Luther King understood why Malcolm X handled the things that he did. I read excerpts where he like talked about, riots and it's the language of the people that, that feel unheard. Those were things that I chose to see and understand. And even like the Black Panther movement, I never saw that as like violent. I saw it as people protecting themselves and standing up for themselves. And it's ironic that, that was the ideology from Mormonism. Because for me, what was violent to me was the enslavement of millions of African people. You know what I mean? Like, that was what was violent to me. Like, the violence that, I saw were the injustices, were the discrepancies, were the blatant brutality of racism, the lynchings of so many people, the massacre of Native American indigenous people, even Native Hawaiians, like the erasure of like all these cultures and people. That was the violence that I saw, not by these leaders.
So in the past few years, this whole public controversy around critical race theory has emerged.
Right.
About what type of curriculum should middle schoolers and elementary schoolers and even high schoolers receive. It sounds like the education you received around race, which I think you view as overwhelmingly positive, played a really important formative role in you understanding yourself, but also the historical context that, for good or for bad, led to the experience that you had growing up. All of that seems like it was positive, and yet just in the past few years, there's been this really, I think, unfortunate, but public conversation about what about race should be taught to kids in K through 12. But it sounds like, would you say you were raised with the critical race theory kind of curriculum or not?
For sure.
And was that positive?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it was all positive. I think I had much more positive experiences than most, even most kids today, which is obviously really sad to say. It makes me sad thinking that we're raising younger generations who will have no idea of like the history and what we have yet to atone and repent for. That makes me sad and angry. But at least for speaking from my experience, I definitely had, I think, a positive, education experience when it came to talking about race. Was it all perfect? No, but it at least gave me kind of the stepping stones where I filled the gaps myself. I didn't stop just in the classroom. I went beyond that. And I would also say I'm also just a natural student, a natural learner. And so I'm grateful to, my high school teacher, Miss Leahy, my U.S. history, even in middle school. I'm grateful for those kinds of stepping stones because it allowed me to open the door to really learning more about those different aspects of U.S. history.
Okay. And what types of activism would have led you on the cover of what newspaper?
What was it? I remember seeing you in...
Yeah,
it was going to cover the Tribune, right?
Yeah.
So what would have landed
Bay Area, San Francisco Chronicles.
And my wife's first comment, she's like, "Oh my gosh, this is awesome! I wonder if her parents realize."
No, I don't know.
You didn't mention any, and I think there's probably humility to your recounting of your own story because you told us nothing about any activities that would have led to you being on the cover of major newspapers. So what was going on?
Really, it was the Black Lives Matter movement. So protests against police brutality. If you understand like the history of Oakland, it was one of the major cities that, African Americans from the South migrated to. They left the South and, growing west, and Oakland just happened to be one of those pockets with a huge presence of the African American community. And so with that, obviously comes with the, a racist history. Still, to this day, a racist history. And obviously, there's different layers to it. But really, it came down to the Black Lives Matter movement, organizing protests where, I mean, my focus at the time was getting youth to be involved, getting youth to, because they had voices as well. I mean, for myself, hearing the stories of like my Black friends, different experiences, even seeing like, I even saw my dad. I remember multiple occasions my dad would be pulled over for broken taillights, and outdated registration, which were never true. And so again, you know, experiencing racial profiling, and seeing my dad experiencing that, and my dad and people being surprised how good my dad's English was. And that was something that, you know, my dad subconsciously, I don't think he realized, but he would read the dictionary. He would practice his English so much so that when people would talk to him, they wouldn't look down on him for having bad English or not being able to speak, you know, the language. So all those aspects, I bring those up to kind of like illustrate really just about being involved. I never saw it as a way like, oh, I have to wait to be an adult to be an advocate now. I can be an advocate right now. And that was always my mindset growing up.
When you were young, and this is an honest question, when you were young, so you have 2008 Prop 8, right?
Yeah.
You're a little kid. You've got 2009 Oscar Grant on BART.
Yes.
Right? Which
Oscar
really in the
Grant,
Bay Area,
yeah.
like very much kicked off.
Yep.
I hesitate even saying that, right? But like brought a lot of attention
For
to Black
sure.
lives. What influence did that have, 2008, 2009 for you?
That's a great question. I think it just made me think, again, with the Prop 8 and realizing like what that was actually talking about. And I remember the feeling of like, I never want to be blindsided, whether it be by religion, whether it be by white people, or whether it be by, you know, outside influences. I want to know for myself what this means and what that means for marginalized communities. And so, and like I said, it's like seeing visibly like police brutality and the presence of police, that wasn't a comforting thing to me growing up. That was a very scary thing. I also had, you know, cousins that, you know, were involved in gangs. So I had experiences, you know, with, you know, what gang violence looked like in Oakland area, also in LA area, but also the history behind that. There's just so much of like my understanding and really learning that I really wanted to be on the right side. That was just my mindset at the time. Constantly was just like, when I think about history books and where I am in history, I want, you know, my future, you know, whoever it is, you know, for those to come to see that, you know, I stood up. I, as a Pacific Islander, Polynesian, Tongan woman, I stood up for Black Lives Matter. I stood up, you know, against, you know, I stood up for, you know, anti-racism, like all these things, like that was very important to me growing up. And again, this was heavily tied to my idea of Christ, and Christ being, you know, this perfect example of like being all inclusive, fighting for equity and justice and all of that. That's who I viewed Christ as growing up. And so that was a huge motivator. My religion meant being out in the streets protesting. That's what, you know, my religion pushed me. That's what that made sense to me, was I'm standing up. I'm flipping tables, as some people say. That was what that meant to me. So again, like a huge part of that was, again, my upbringing being LDS, and thinking about Christ and his example to me was really at the forefront of being involved in different protests and demonstrations across the Bay Area growing up.
And this is going to sound like a dumb question, but you did not identify as Black or as African American at all.
No, not at all.
But you just felt as an American, as a Mormon, as a Christian, and even as a Tongan.
Yeah, as a Tongan American, I would say.
Tongan American.
Yeah.
You felt some sort of connection with the African American experience and a desire to become an advocate for Black Lives Matter.
Yes, 100%, for sure. And also
in Oakland.
Yes, in Oakland. And also, like I mentioned, like the Polynesian Panther movement within New Zealand, and also the Native Hawaiian history, like those were, I saw Pacific Islanders within the civil rights movement. I saw myself in fighting for human rights and fighting for civil rights. I saw myself in that history, and so for me, it was a no-brainer in being a part of that. And if anything, I didn't see anybody else doing it, so for me, it was just like, I'm going to do it. I'm not going to wait for somebody else. And that was always my dad's mentality too. Like, my dad was the first, right, to be baptized, was the first to come to America. And for him, it was just like, I'm not going to wait for somebody else to show me how to do it. I'm going to do it myself. So that was something that he instilled in me growing up. And I used that and I did it to this. I don't think he meant it for that. He definitely didn't raise me to, I don't think he had the intention of me, with a blowhorn and organizing protests and being on news channels. I don't think that was at all his intentions, but that's what I channeled it into.
So what types of activities, just to summarize, what types of activities you were involved in or spearheaded as a high schooler in Oakland, a sweet Mormon Tongan girl, high schooler? You're leading what? With bullhorns? What do you? Yeah. What were your main civil rights activities in high school?
Yeah, a lot of it was just super big on community involvement. So, I mean, there were already activist groups. Again, the Bay Area has a huge history with fighting for human rights. So that history, that foundation already existed. What I did as a high schooler was I sought after those groups. And again, like I mentioned, I came with the perspective that let's get young people. Young people, they should have an opinion on this. And we think back to the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King, he was only 25, 26. He was my age. And I remember finding that I'm like, he was young.
You're saying in the 50s when he started.
Yes. And even just in general, the entire civil rights movement, and Nate, you can chime in as well. It was young people that led these formative movements that have changed the course of history as we see today. Nate, do you want to add anything?
Just that, yeah. I mean, it was college students. It was, kids. One of the biggest reasons that the civil rights movement went national was when news crews filmed those children being sprayed by fire hoses in Alabama.
Yep.
When they were being attacked by dogs. Those were kids, right?
Exactly.
And so when those images went, viral in whatever sense you could use that in the 60s, that's what gained a lot of sympathy. And it's, it was celebrated by Dr. King and by John Lewis and by a few others because they wanted that sympathy to kind of reach out to everyone. So yeah, it's always been young people at the forefront of these things. And honestly, a lot of people who are older tend to kind of be more comfortable with the status quo or want to keep things the same way a lot of times. It's younger people that are pushing things like that forward. And so that was the case with the civil rights movement, and it's kind of still the case now.
Yes, 100%. No, yeah, thank you for sharing that. But yeah, a huge part of it was just I saw young people in the history that I was studying, and for me as a young person, I drew inspiration from that. Just because, I mean, even with my sister and even my family as a whole, we were just always involved. And even for me, like my friendships, again, I really go back to, I'm so grateful for the integral friend group that I had because we had conversations. It wasn't always constant, but it was really around the time, when Obama was president and really talking about, what does it mean? What does it mean when we talk about, racism within this country? Those were things that were very important to me to highlight and to talk about. And so, yeah, when it came to my involvement, it was really just community groups, different clubs. I started like the Polynesian club at my high school. And so with that, we talked about, Polynesian history, Native Hawaiian history. And so just really building this kind of foundation of like, let's talk about these things. What can we do? And really believing that we could have an influence. Even my sister, she was interviewed by BuzzFeed at the time. She was she was super young, 13, 14, if that. She did an interview with BuzzFeed about the protests that she had led as well. And so kind of that collaboration with my sister back and forth and my collaboration with people within my high school that also believed in the same things that I did, that gave me the momentum to do the things that I did in terms of like protests and doing interviews as well.
What protests were you leading as a high schooler in Oakland, as a Mormon Tongan woman high schooler in Oakland? You were protesting what and how?
Again, it goes back to the Black Lives Matter movement. So protesting against police brutality, especially in the city of Oakland, and really just not even just in Oakland, across the entire Bay Area, just protesting against police brutality, protesting against
picket lines. What?
Yes. So with like posters like out in the streets. So getting permits or not getting permits. Kind of trying to cheat the system. So yeah, whether it was like in-person protests or demonstrations where we would gather at the Capitol, gather together with huge groups of people. Or also we would do chained lines against, police officers with their batons and shields. Yeah, a lot of different things. Even public council meetings. That was another thing as well. That's something that I was passionate about. I was very passionate in the fact that there are so many ways to quote unquote protest. So many ways to be an activist and be involved, because there are people that we're scared to be on the streets protesting, being in the presence of police, and so there are other ways, whether it be volunteering with nonprofits or things like that.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
And it kind of it's along the same lines, but you mentioned earlier that there's like an undercurrent of anti-blackness within Polynesian culture.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And then in my experience. Most of my experience with Polynesian people, I spent a few years in Hawaii. I was born there, but I was also very young. So most of my experience with Polynesian people has been at BYU. In my experience, there tends to be a strong element of anti-blackness when it comes to actually dealing with Black people and people of color. But then there's also this kind of duality where Black culture is also a huge part of Polynesian culture.
Oh, yes.
So I guess how did you... was it the same in Oakland, or did you find it to be different at BYU? And then kind of how did you deal with that and reconcile having people in having other Polynesian people who maybe weren't as aligned with the protesting and the things that you were passionate about? Yeah,
that's a really great question. I'm glad that you brought that up. Well, for one, everything that you're saying, I completely agree with. There is that duality where it's just there's this anti-blackness, but then also this claim over things that are predominantly come from Black culture. Mm-hmm. It's so weird. And I even to this day, I'm still trying to grapple my mind over why that is. I mean, it even comes down to the style, the shoes, Jordans, the things that people wear, the music that people listen to. I my brothers and we grew up listening to rap and hip hop. That's one of my favorite genres of music. My favorite artist growing up was Tupac. That was also my brother's favorite artist. So it's so much of the entertainment and music and all of that and art in all of its forms, fashion, whatever that was attributed back to Black culture. But it's so interesting because there is that anti-Blackness. And I think a lot of it just comes down to... Are
you saying it was Tongan to value Black culture, and yet there's anti...
No, I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
I what I'm saying is that in the areas where Tongans grew up, at least for me, and growing up in the Bay Area, there was also a huge Black presence. And with that, there was this kind of mesh or mixture of culture that Tongans adopted as American culture, but really is Black culture.
So
does that make sense?
Your white peers at your high school would have also liked Tupac and worn Nike.
No, I wouldn't say that at all. No, not at all. I would say the students of color. So Latin American communities.
Got it.
My Polynesian communities. Liked things that came from Black culture.
But
does that make sense?
Part of a Polynesian community? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah. Uniquely, yes and no. I would say yes and no. The reason why I say that is just I didn't grow up with Polynesian friends. I honestly didn't. Unless you count my cousins, but obviously they were my family already. And so like I mentioned, I grew up around Black people. But going back to your question, Nate, how I reconciled that, I really just think it was my quest in understanding Black history and what that looks like. A lot of Polynesian people don't make that effort. Mm-hmm. They don't make the effort to understand or really understand the scope of how horrible and inhumane that it was. And so for them, they're just almost disassociated with it. And so for them, it's okay to continue in this, blind ideology of like anti-blackness, this idea that, and like blackness is inferior, it's less than. But then at the same time, on the other side of the coin, it's also super cool and it's popular, the popular thing to do. Listening to rap is quote unquote cool, or wearing Jordans and Nike shoes is it's in, it's stylish, it's fashion right now. And so it's this weird, like, two sides of the coin. Yeah. Duality, where it's just like, when it comes down to issues for Black people, I don't see people from my community that stand up to those things. But when it comes to Black art, they take advantage of that, or that's they'll accept that. They'll take that, but not the rest that comes with it. Whereas for me, I see both. And what's more important to me is uplifting Black voices and that Black history that is so important to what it means to be American. I think that's the issue that Pacific Islanders and Polynesians, they don't understand. They have this, frame of what it means to be American to them, but I don't think they have the full picture, nor do they make the effort to have the full picture. Whereas I did make that effort, and so I think that's why I was able to not let that, undertone of anti-Blackness affect me, because I made a concerted effort to look beyond that and see how much of a disservice that is to my culture and just how I live. Does that make sense? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. That makes sense. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, Nate, when we talk, like, there's going to be a lot of white Mormons or Polynesian Mormons that are like, anti-Blackness, what are you talking about? Like, are you saying that it would be, Nate, your perspective that Mormon Polynesians weren't big fans of Black people? Like, is that kind of what you're saying? What do we mean by Polynesian anti-Blackness?
So kind of what I mentioned earlier with whiteness being the standard, Black people within the church, not really, we're not high up, right? If that makes sense. And so a big part of whiteness, and it's different from being a white person, like whiteness and white culture are kind of different things. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize that, but like whiteness is like the idea of white supremacy.
Yes.
That kind of goes along with everything. And then there's, white culture, which, like Italian culture or like wherever you may be from, that's like the culture part. But like whiteness, just like plain old American whiteness, is usually like white nationalism, white supremacy, right? So with the idea of whiteness, a huge part of whiteness is like separating yourself as much as possible from Blackness. Mm-hmm. If you look at like the situation with like Jewish people and Black people back in the day, Jewish people and Black people, we lived in the same neighborhoods. Like the ghetto is a Jewish word, right? Because we were all in the same area. But then as part of kind of moving away from that and like, moving from that idea of being dirty whites, Jewish people elevated themselves to a level of whiteness, right, that separated them from Black people, right?
Kind of assimilation a little bit.
Exactly, right. And so, and that's been evident with, lots of other groups as well that have done that. And so the idea of elevating whiteness is separating yourself or distancing yourself from Blackness. And so with that standard of whiteness in Polynesian culture, there's also a distancing from Black people, but not necessarily Black culture, right, where you see like people, enjoying Black art and things like that. Or even, one thing that I've run into a lot at BYU was a lot of Polynesian people wanting to say the N-word, but also not wanting to rock with Black people, right? So it's like, you don't want to talk with Black people. You want to avoid us. There were people who vehemently opposed Black Menaces, spoke out against it, didn't
and
like
Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, and Black Lives Matter. Very conservative, very right-wing ideals.
BYU Polynesian students that were against the Black Lives Matter movement and what the Black Menaces were doing at BYU, which we'll get to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they would be against all of those things and then be vocal about being against it, but then at the same time be wanting to consume elements of Black culture. So when we talk about anti-blackness or the standard of whiteness, it's that idea of like distancing yourself from Black people and things like that. But then at the same time, the duality of like, oh, this part of Black culture is cool. Or, oh, I listen to hip hop music, but I don't talk to Black people. Or, oh, I don't support Black Lives Matter, but I love, this particular Black artist or whatever, So that,
Yeah.
Well, as a way to kind of, I'm thinking this is going to be a 2-part episode because there's so much more I want to explore if you all have time. But like, there's something that I was feeling very strongly right before Nate asked his question, which is like, Nate, I don't remember in your story, you as a high school student leading demonstrations for the Black Lives Matter movement, and you're Black,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So like the idea that Saane is like a woman, faithful Mormon, Polynesian, as an older sister, kind of raising her siblings, playing a mother role, but also as going to be the first member of her family to go to college. So trying to becoming a straight A student, you're carrying all that, which is remarkable in and of itself. And then you're adding on top of that, being as an advocate for the Black Lives Matter movement when you're not Black. When Nate, you wouldn't have even as a Mormon kid growing up felt, I don't know, was it not the desire or the ability or the belief system to even want to play that role?
I just didn't know enough. I was very ignorant as a teenager, and
I'm not shaming you, just to be clear.
No, I don't feel shame at all. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I was very ignorant, and I was kind of kept in the dark about a lot of those things, and I didn't really have like access to learn about it in a lot of ways. But that's why we love Saane, because Saane has always been a real one, right? She's been doing this from early on.
No, Nate, when you hear Saane tell the story that as a high schooler, Mormon girl, Polynesian, she's leading Black Lives Matter protests. Mm-hmm. What does that make you think and feel?
It's amazing to me, right? Because it's something rare. Like very few. Let me see. I don't think I've ever met another Polynesian person who is as supportive and as much of an ally to Black people as Saane is, right? Mm-hmm. So it's something that's very unique.
I don't think I've met a white or a Black person either who's Mormon that did what Saane did.
Mm-hmm. I've known other Black people.
In high school.
I've known other Black people who have done things in activism. I was kind of late to the party. I was a bit of a late bloomer when it came to activism and things like that.
So you have met some Black Mormons who in their high school years were leading Black Lives Matter protests.
Oh yeah, Rachel and Sebastian.
Okay,
of the Black Menaces. Yeah,
so we got to get them on.
Shout out to my roommate exactly. Rachel. Yes.
And they're graduating now. Sebastian's graduated, so maybe we can get them on here. But
so they would have been doing what Saane did.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, and several
For
other
sure.
people that I've known. But I was just one of those that was late to the party.
But Sane's pretty cool.
Oh yeah.
Oh gosh.
Oh my gosh.
Saane knows she's proud Polynesian, proud Tongan, but she knows she's honorary Black too.
Honorary Black. That's cool.
Yes.
And I guess but isn't it also remarkable that she was ready to go on to her mission without ever mentioning that this was such an important part of her identity? There's some humility there that's also just incredibly profound to me. Mm-hmm. So this is my way of just saying how honored and humbled and impressed I am.
Appreciate that.
With you and what you've done just up through high school.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
That's remarkable. Yeah. And I think that's why you wanted to come.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've always been amazed and impressed with Saane and with everything that she does and the way that she balances her life. And she does it in such a way that is very open and radically inclusive of everyone, right? Including people like me who, weren't out on the streets marching, but felt that inclusion from Saane. Like everyone, like literally love over everything since she was a kid.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, so let's go ahead and say that we're gonna kind of wrap up this part one, take a little break, and then come back with part two. But take us up through graduating from high school.
Yeah.
Like, how are you viewing what your future is going to be? Because it's such a complex synthesis of your Christianity, your Mormonism, your Tongan culture, and your social justice advocacy. If I were to have interviewed you as a graduating senior, in high school, you would say, "This is my future. My future is what?" What would you have said at the time?
Oh, that's a great question. Wow. In the headspace that I was in at that time, how I would have answered that question, it would have been continuing my activism. That was never something that I saw myself stopping. If anything, graduating high school kind of, ignited this spark and this fearlessness that I was going to continue doing this wherever that was. And so that my next step was BYU. And so it would have been...
Which is a natural next step for a budding advocate who loves Black Lives Matter. Of course, BYU. It's not Berkeley. It's not Stanford.
It's not.
No, it's BYU. No, it's not a, historically Black college.
Yeah.
No, I'm being sarcastic.
Right, yeah.
But did you note the irony of BYU as a choice, given that you were a Black Lives Matter activist? Did you note that?
That's a great question. I don't think I really understood the irony of that at the time because, and again, it's funny now because I'm just like, of all places.
Of course, BYU.
You don't really know what you're getting into.
No, again, like Nate said, I don't think I really understood what that experience at BYU would like. I think at the time I looked at BYU as I was the only Mormon. I was the only member of the church, of the LDS church. And in all of the spheres of in elementary, middle school, high school, when it came to, being at protests and whatnot, I didn't see other members from my stake or from my ward that were, with me fighting for these things, standing up for Black Lives Matters and queer rights and all those things. But for me, what was so important about all of those things is the fact that my religion influenced, my belief in Christ influenced that. And so I saw BYU as this is what Christ does for me and influences me and inspires me to do. I'm going to be around people who also all believe and share the same religion. So to me, I looked at it as an opportunity to be in a community of other members like me, because I didn't really have that growing up. I was just one of the few Mormons growing up. And so for me, I looked at BYU as this will be nice to be around other people of the same faith. That was really what it looked like to me. And so all of this, background, history of my life, that was connected to my faith. And so in my mind, I'm coming to the same room. And obviously I was so wrong, but that was really my mindset at the time in my headspace that, okay, I'm going to be with people from my religious community, the same faith. Yeah.
Beautiful. All right. Well, so that's kind of a cliffhanger because we're going to, now that we have Saane's amazing story up through high school, we're going to now venture to part 2 of her story, which is what's it like to go on a mission? How did that influence her views of Mormonism? Because you were clearly sheltered from a lot of Mormon history.
For sure.
That you ended up feeling maybe uncomfortable about. And then what was it like to go to BYU and what were your experiences there?
Yeah.
And how has that led to where you are now? And has there been a faith journey? Have your views on Mormonism and your Mormon faith and your Mormon beliefs, how have those changed over time?
Yeah.
That's the cliffhanger. Yeah?
Yep.
Anything you want to say to close this episode? Oh, I was going to say, if I were to ask you, you're graduating high school, what's your life going to be like? What are the major milestones you're going to hit?
Ooh.
Let's end with that. How would you have answered that question? Now that I'm graduating from high school, these are the main things I'm going to do in my life. What would you say?
Yeah. I mean, first off, I'll say graduating high school, that was a very emotional time for me, just in the sense that it felt like I was leaving an era because I had so much momentum with my activism, so much momentum with building these relationships within the Bay Area and within my high school community, even with the principal down to the teachers and, the PTA, all these things. I was so proud to leave that legacy behind, but I was also very scared of what that would look like, how that would morph into and change moving forward. Obviously, having had made the decision to go to BYU, what I would have said my next steps would have been, I would have said the mission.
You're going on a mission?
I'm going on a mission. I don't think I would have said marriage. I probably would have said that I'm going to graduate BYU, go on to my master's or PhD. That was a goal, always has been a goal of mine, is to just pursue higher education. So that's probably, at that time, that's probably what I would have said. So just furthering my education and going on mission, but also with intentions of furthering my activism. Didn't know what that would have looked like, but I knew that's something that would have continued regardless.
But you would have had a ultimate hope about temple marriage.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And maybe motherhood or maybe not.
Yeah. So I would add that. Yeah, maybe a hope for marriage and having children. I don't think at that time I was like, oh, this is going to happen. That I don't think I had that. It was
a question mark for you.
Yes, it was a question mark.
As to whether or not you would marry.
Yes. Even date somebody, even get into a relationship. That was a question for me. Yeah.
Okay. And if I'd said, will you marry a white boy or a Polynesian boy or what? A Mormon boy, what would you have said as a senior?
Ooh, probably someone LDS, but nothing to do with any specific race or ethnic background. I would have just said question mark. I don't know.
And if we were to ask you, will you have kids someday? What would you have said at graduating high school?
Hopefully.
And married, temple marriage and children.
Hopefully.
Okay. But it was a question mark for you.
Question mark. Yes.
Okay. And if I would have said, will you always be a faithful Mormon, what would you have said?
Ooh, gosh. Obviously, 26-year-old Saane now has a different answer. But if I'm being true to my version of Saane at that time, I would have said yes. That I would have always remained a faithful Mormon. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So that's a cliffhanger for what happens next. So thanks so much for joining us for this part one of Saane Siale's story. And Nate, thank you so much for being a part of part one.
Of course.
And
happy to be here.
You too, Beau. Thanks for making this happen. It's great to have your perspective here as well.
Thanks for having me. It's good to hear Saane's story. I love it.
All right. All right. Don't go away. Come right back for part two because we want to see how this story, and we're going to talk about Saane's experience on her mission, her time at BYU, how she interfaced with the Black Menaces, but also how you advocated for inclusion and diversity at BYU.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, that's correct.
Which is an important part of your story.
Right. It is.
And then how your faith has progressed not just through BYU, but now that you've graduated from BYU and how that's affected your impressions of the church today and the role of the church in your life today.
For sure.
That's all coming, right?
Yes.
All right. So thanks for joining us for part one. Come right back for part two. And this has been great. So thanks, Saane.
Thank you.